Each night, a candle is lit, and the whispering tomes open. Inside are the strange, the forgotten, the stories time tried to silence. Some say history is written by the victors, but here the lost are given voice. Breathe deeply and follow me into the hidden chapters of history.
Before the fire settles and the night begins to breathe, remember this name, Richard Dadd, a painter of perfect lines and restless visions, born in quiet Kent and destined for the long halls of Asylum. His hand once traced fairies and kings with steady grace, until the same imagination turned inward and began to whisper. This isn't a tale of evil, but of devotion mistaken for duty, of a man who listened to the voices between the brushstrokes. A night at peak tension. You stand in a quiet room. A small jeweled knife catches a faint glow. A father's voice asks a simple question, and your breath stalls. He waits. You're near enough to hear the brush in a jar, bristles ticking the rim like a clock. A name, old as stone, slips through the air. Remember it. Tonight we follow a gifted painter, praised earlier, who changed on the road. Art, family, and a mind under strain converge here. We'll rewind to see how belief turned into threat, and why the choice felt like duty. Get comfortable, and let's begin. A promising brush in early Victorian London. You start in Chatham, a dockyard town where work and tide set the pace. His father copies figures for a living, a clerk with careful hands. In that house, the boy draws. You see him bend over scrap paper, working by winter light, finding order in line. Teachers notice. He notices too, because praise lands fast on young ears. By the time he's a teenager, the path seems set. He'll try front. The Royal Academy's schools open their doors to him. You step inside those rooms. Chalk dust in the air, casts of antique bodies staring back. He learns the canon, the old way, life drawing, measured proportions, clean edges, a discipline of the eye. You can feel the safe rhythm of precision. That rhythm never leaves him. Early exhibitions come, and with them a circle of rising artists, trading sketches and opinions. You hear the talk. Shakespearean scenes are in demand. Theatre light is the language patrons understand. He studies the stage to paint the stage. His figures stand like actors, faces angled to catch the air as if a lamp just lifted. The critics note his detail. The word that keeps coming up is exact. Patronage finds him. Small commissions, first book, illustrations, refined vignettes, and then larger chances. Confidence builds on a scaffold of approvals. You watch him move through a small exhibition, one of those rooms that smell like varnish and wet wool. He touches frames as he passes, a private habit. Someone points to his work, proud of the clean edges and the control. You look closer. The edges are very sharp, almost too sharp. Forms are sealed tight, like containers. It's beautiful, and it's a little airless. He draws Shakespeare. He draws fair scenes, night glens, and actors mid-speech. The detail is dense, but legible. Every blade of grass in the right place. He paints as if order itself is the subject. Friends say he's quiet, but funny in a dry way. He works long hours and breaks for long walks. In his notes you catch a pattern: lists, schedules, little boxes around tasks, checks and cross-checks. It feels like calm, because calm is what good structures give. Success grows. A patron invites him to something grander. A tour across Europe and eastward Rome, Athens, the Levant. Egypt guiding a patron's son and capturing the sights. It's an honor, and it's pressure. You watch the letter arrive, folded tight, the seal cracked by a nail. He reads it twice before he smiles. Everyone around him sees the future. He'll gather old light and bring it home. Now you're with him as he prepares. The lists multiply: sketchbooks, nibs, pigments that travel well, linen, references for ruins he hasn't yet seen. He goes to the river and stares at the Thames as if it's the start of something huge. It is. You can hear the city around him, the clop of hooves, a bell, the hum of a crowd, fading under the thought of older stones, older rivers, other gods. Before he leaves, he paints a few last canvases to secure income. The technique is tidy, the tone confident. Reviewers use phrases that amount to promise. You watch him pin a clipping to a wall, then pin a note beneath it. Work more true. That phrase clings to you. He's already exact. He wants truer than exact. The Royal Academy name gives him a ticket into good rooms, and he learns how to play those rooms with grace. But the private hours matter more. In them, he refines a habit you'll see again later, a focus so tight that the world outside the paper goes faint. He can hold still. He can hold still for a very long time. Pews stand beside him the night before departure. The bag is packed. The sketchbooks are wrapped. A friend toasts him in a low tavern with smoke on the ceiling. He laughs, and you hear the lift in his voice. He's heading toward the grand sources of his craft, places where the myths lived and the stones still speak. The sentence lands oddly in your earstones speaking, but it feels harmless here, like a poet's flourish at a send-off. Walk with him to the dock. The lists, the sketchbooks, the tickets, the care with which he keeps objects in their place. You notice his breath. It's quick, then he slows it. When he looks at the water, the sharpness in him brightens. He's not just going to paint. He's going to test himself against the oldest shapes he can find. The plan is ambitious and tidy. The road will test both. Back in London, people whisper that he'll come back transformed. They mean improved. You think about the word and how it has more than one face. For now, the tone is light. He thanks his father for help with papers and money. The older man, practical, proud, tells him to write often. You watch the son promise, then look away first. The bond is warm. It will be asked to hold more than it can. In these early rooms you also meet the seeds of his themes. He loves theatre and folklore, especially the borderlands, where charm and threat brush sleeves. Fair scenes let him practice intricate order. Small figures, small props, no accident allowed. He keeps notes on light, as if light can be filed. When you hold one of his sketches close, you feel a hum of effort. The line is not casual. It's etched by a mind soothed by structure. At that small exhibition again, you'll notice the edges one more time. Too sharp. A voice in you says, "Not wrong, just taught." Beauty wound tight is a kind of hint. You file that feeling like he files his notes, It will help you later when the order strains. The invitation to travel arrives as a brass key to rooms he's dreamed of. It's also a test of a mind that loves control. Travel loosens things, time, sleep, certainty. He accepts, because this is what artists do when the door opens. As he steps toward the gangway, the city behind him feels already like a picture, framed and complete. Honor fills his chest. So does expectation. He's representing a patron, a school, a nation's taste abroad. You can sense the weight of that on a young spine. He straightens, anyway. He has a job. He has a plan. He doesn't yet see how the plan will meet places where plans don't hold. So you stand beside him at the rail as London drifts away. The water churns. The lists are tucked in his coat. He keeps a hand on them, not for money, but for order. The order feels like safety. He will need it, and he will find, soon, that order can turn into something else, under heat and old names. Departure. The grand tour begins. You feel the ship shudder as ropes uncoil and the quay drifts back. He stands near you at the rail, neat coat, a portfolio hugged close. The patron's son, buoyant and eager, talks roots and ruins. An entourage moves like a small court servant's, a guide with a careful smile, a tutor who speaks in measured phrases. The plan is mapped: Paris and Milan by road, then Rome, across to Athens. Later, the Levant and Egypt, a sweep through the lands that raised the old story. You sense his breath even out. Lists have become action. He has cleared London's noise. He'll meet older noise next. The rush of embarkation leaves its echo in you. You feel the weight of his packed sketchbooks, the neat roll of brushes, the wrapped pigments that resist heat. He checks them again, a small ritual. You catch the choice of paper, strong, smooth, capable of fine cross-hatching. He doesn't say much. He doesn't need to. The way his hands settle the case says enough. This is his craft in a box. Roads first. Pass vineyards and hill towns. Stone bridges and markers chipped by time. In Rome, the air tastes of dust and lime. He walks the Forum with quick, purposeful steps, counting columns by habit, sketching pilasters like a clerk counts sums. The entourage falls into a rhythm. Morning visits to sites, midday shade, evening notes by lamplight. He writes home with energy and wit. He read over his shoulder short accounts of statues and street scenes, an aside about a lively cafe, a line about an arch that looks like it could still bear the weight of an empire. Pinned studious and ruins, he's all attention. He measures with the eye, checks with the hand. His pencil moves in tight strokes, and you hear the dry whisper of graphite on paper. He isn't a tourist. He's gathering forms. The plan is to translate these into scenes that patrons will understand: Shakespearean airs, classical backdrops, clean drama. The plan still fits. Athens opens on clear light, edges sharpened by the sky. He notes the fluting on columns, the way shadows wrap like quiet water. He loves the geometry. You feel it steady him. He speaks easily at dinner, laughs at the patron's son's jokes, draws a quick portrait on a napkin to please the table. He sleeps, but not deeply. You notice he wakes early to arrange his tools, to straighten piles that weren't crooked. Crisp You press forward by steam and sail along the Levant coasts. Ports, blurstone, quays, tight alleys, sounds of trade. The letters home stay steady but begin to thin in warmth. He reports rather than muses. You feel a small draft enter the prose. He writes more about structure, less about delight. One problem creeps in. Sleep grows thin. The days heat up, and the nights carry a restless hum. He starts to work with a fiercer hand after dusk when others rest. You sit nearby and hear the urgency in the strokes. It's still control, but the grip tightens. He becomes exacting about routine. Meals at certain hours. Walks at measured lengths. Interruptions irritate him more than they should. He's polite. The edge lives under the politeness. On a deck under stars, he stands longer than the air calls for. You stand with him. The sea glints like metal filings. He watches the horizon until you feel your own eyes strain. He whispers numbers, counts of waves, counts of stars in a cluster, counts of breaths to slow the heart. The tutor approaches, friendly, and he gives a small nod that ends the talk before it can start. Then Egypt calls. Even the guide's tone shifts when he says the name. Cairo presses in with heat and voice. Geyser throws glare and clean triangles that cut the sky. You watch him meet the desert rhythm air rye. Midday cover, long evenings where the heat sits like a second shirt. He sketches temples and reliefs with a new intensity. The forms are ancient and sure. He responds with the only answer he knows. Ordered marks, accumulated with patience. The entourage notices. His talk sharpens. His gaze fixes. He peers at carvings as if language sits there, waiting. He starts to connect motifs across sites, across days. You hear him make links, like a scholar charting a system. He asks the guide about the old gods, the roles and names, the rituals. He doesn't treat it as color. He treats it as structure. You feel a shift. The past isn't just reference. It's becoming current. At night, on the Nile deck, you feel the soft slap of water on wood and stars like small pinholes above. He leans close to the rail and breathes as if taking instruction. He mentions hearing purpose not think loud, nothing dramatic, just a sense that the old names still act. The tutor tries to laugh it off. The guide doesn't laugh. He says a few words, low and rhythmic, and the phrase lands on the table like a small stone. Let us home change again. You don't see the smile in the lines anymore. He writes of mission and order, of signs, of being called to correct what's wrong in unseen ways. He still draws beautifully. The sketches gain an almost manic finish every blade, every crease. He insists on finishing a study even when the sun says stop. The entourage waits in the shade and watches him bake. Meanwhile, he grows careful about food. He refuses certain dishes, muttering about purity. He switches seats, often, wary that someone might be watching. You sit across from him during a roadside pause, and he tests you, friend or agent. The question comes in a calm tone, but it has no humor. You answer gently. He marks your words like ledger entries. On ship between ports, confinement amplifies belief. The walls and rails make patterns of sound, water, rope, metal, and he hears them as signals. He sketches with furious control to anchor the mind. You can see that this is both habit and defense. He fills page after page with tiny lines that hold a world in place. He speaks of work with a doubled meaning, the art and something else. The plan on arrival back in England is clear. Rest, family, medical opinion. The patron's son and the tutor agree in private. You're there outside the door, hearing their low voices. They don't want to shame him. They want him safe. He declares that the work isn't finished. He says it quietly, but the quiet is hard. The guide's eyes flick to the floor. Rome had steadied him. Athens had pleased him. The Levant had stretched him thin. Egypt pressed into him and left a weight. You carry that map inside you now, marked not just by places, but by pressure. The tour was meant to gather forms. It gathered something else as well: heed, ritual, and a name old as stones. He doesn't drop that name. He holds it like a tool, and the road ahead bends around it. Egypt, heat, temples, and a name from stone, Cairo, greets you with a press of bodies and sun. Streets tangle. Voices rise and fall like a market chant. He moves among them with his portfolio tight to his side, eyes narrowed, sorting noise into line. Dust lifts from hooves and settles on his cuffs. You feel him ignore it. The guide speaks in clipped English, patient, moving the party through shade whenever it appears. He nods, polite, but his gaze is already far toward the west, where the desert meets the sky in hard geometry. At Giza, the glare flattens everything except the edges. The pyramids stand not as pictures but as forces. He removes his hat, wipes his brow, and sets his box on a square of cloth to keep sand out of hinges. You kneel nearby to read his marks. He isn't sketching Romans. He is counting faces, measuring base to angle, mapping the light. A camel snorts, and the sound snaps like a string. He doesn't startle. He's locked in. Pursue the first contact with the desert's rhythm. Mornings are crisp and focused. By noon, heat lies across the mind like a weight. After dusk, the world loosens. He uses the loosened hours to tighten his work. The others tell stories. He makes grids. You notice the first shift in his talk. Small, but there. He remarks that old forms hold rules that newer men forgot. It sounds like a thesis. It feels like a pledge. Temples spool out along the itinerary. Columns move from ruin to almost whole. Reliefs retain their cut. The guide's voice takes on the cadence of a liturgy as he names gods and rites. At one wall, you lean in to see the line of a figure with green skin and a crook and flail. The guide says the name softly, Osiris. He repeats it, then adds roles Lord of the Dead, Judge, emblem of order and renewal, torn and mended, killed and raised within a cycle that promised balance. He presses his palm to the warm stone, not touching the carving, but hovering near it. His mouth shapes the name like a question and an answer at once. He begins to copy a panel with almost surgical care. The pencil tip-taps, lifts, taps again. He files the god among columns, but you know he's filed more than an image. You see it in the way his posture eases, as if he has found a word for the feeling he's carried since the ship. Night on the Nile offers a different stage. The deck creaks, and the river whispers against wood. Lantern light pools on planks. Stars look like pinholes threaded by a slow hand. He stands at the rail with you, mapping constellations to names the guide taught that afternoon. He murmurs the old words without trying on irony. He says that order has a keeper. He says that keepers have tasks. It lands gentle but firm. You answer with a joke to soften the edge. He doesn't take it. Companions begin to note changes out loud. The patron's son lowers his voice, a shade uneasy. The tutor keeps his tone even, as if tone alone can soothe the mind back to rest. They whisper about sleep. He hasn't had much. They whisper about food. He's grown selective, refusing what he calls tainted by process. You watch him sit apart at meals, turning a cup a quarter-inch until it aligns with a plate, then a spoon. He notices you noticing and smiles, as if to say, "It's nothing." At Stendera, the guide chants in a tone caught between teaching and prayer. The hall is forested with columns. The ceiling holds stars in blue. He steps into the shade and tips his head back. The chant threads the stone. He closes his eyes, and later he writes that voices urged him. Not a roar, not a command, an urging, a nudge. The phrase he uses is quiet and practical voices, advising as if he's a clerk taking instruction. You test him gently. On a slow afternoon under an awning, you ask what he thinks the voices want. He speaks of correction, of acts that secure balance. He doesn't mention names. He doesn't need to. The god with the green skin lives in the lines around his eyes now. He says that hidden actors move pieces, and that some pieces must be removed when they don't belong. He says it evenly, the way he would say that a line is crooked. His notebooks shift. You've seen pages of studies, hands, drapery, capitals. Now, interleaved, are lists that read like instructions, times, conditions. You can't tell if they're for art or for something outside it. He numbers them, then renumbers them to put one item first. Rumor inside the small party grows into worry. The tutor proposes a rest day. He declines, citing momentum. He begins to suspect conversation. He sits with his back to walls. Meanwhile, he works with a control so fierce it startles. Tiny cross-hatching locks form to form. He sets a brush to a thumbnail of color with breath held and releases it like a watchmaker placing a spring. The work is still brilliant. It's also becoming a seal. You see the sealing happen. Each mark locks the world and locks him in. The guide tries folklore as a bomb. He tells a story about a traveler mistaking a breeze for a god sigh, and then living politely, just in case. The group laughs. He nods once, as if to thank the guide for the data. Then he asks a question too technical for the mood. The order of rites, the logic of offerings, the chain of duty from God to human agent. The guide answers because that's his job. The answer does not soothe. One evening, a small detail shifts the room. The chant again, from a nearby shrine, floats in on a slow wind. He stops mid-stroke. The pencil lifts and hovers. You watch his eyes go to the middle distance where meaning gathers. After, he writes a line that you'll see later in a hospital ledger quoted back, that there are tasks only the clear-sighted will do because others fear the cut that sets things right. From Cairo, south to Thebes, the landscape repeats in a way that builds pressure. Villages, palms, stone, glare, relief. He begins to read patterns everywhere, on water, in insect swarms, even in the tapping of a rope against mast. You hear him explain to the patron sun, kindly, that not all patterns are benign. Some are messages. The sun looks down and ties a knot twice. You consider telling him directly that he's moved onto a narrow path. You don't. You're a witness more than an actor. You keep pace and record the scene the way he records lines, faithfully, with attention to edge and weight. You look for places where the story can breathe. The desert doesn't give many. A small mercy arrives in the form of a cool morning breeze. He works calmly for an hour. The tutor tells a joke and earns a real laugh. It's there, the old warmth, like a coin found in a pocket you thought was empty. Then the wind shifts, the heat returns, and with it that upright posture that means ideas have clicked into place. By the time the party turns toward Syria and Palestine, the name from stone rides with you. Osiris isn't a motif in a sketchbook anymore. He has become an organizing idea in a mind built for order. The companions see it. You feel it. Clarity slips. Certainty grows. When the boat noses north, you catch him counting under his breath. Stars, ropes, reasons. He straightens each count like a column in a ledger. Somewhere inside those numbers, a mission has found him. Syria and Palestine. Certainty hardens. Land rises in gentler folds as you leave the Nile behind. The air dries to a clear edge, and the road threads through hills where olive trees hold the light like small lamps. He walks ahead, steps measured, eyes scanning, as if the earth itself carries script. The guide names towns with layered histories. He listens, nods, and then asks about sites where judgments were said to be made. You hear the word judgment more often now. It lands with weight. Landscapes of scripture carry their own pull. Ruins tug at meaning. Stone arches stand without roofs, like ribs. He sketches the curve of a lintel and writes a note beneath it that is not about angle but about rightness. His notebooks have shifted. He turns a page and expects at his hands drapery but find instructions. Lines like, attend to sign at dusk. Do not accept food unoffered by hand you trust. Keep watch. He numbers them. He underlines some. These are not artist reminders. They read as orders. At a roadside pause, dust settles, and the group drinks from tin cups. He sits with his back to a wall, scanning the road. Then he tests you, friend or agent. The words are simple, the gaze steady. You say friend. He holds the silence a beat longer than comfort before nodding once, as if logging a result. He asks about a man you passed earlier with a bundle of reeds. Was he followed? Did he mark the time? You say, no. He persists, are you sure? You say yes. He rests the cup on his knee and aligns its rim with a seam in his trousers. On some days he refuses food. He calls certain breads worked, as if touch alone can infect. He eats from packages he wrapped himself. The patron son keeps smiling, keeps bridging, but you hear strain in the questions. The tutor tries calm persuasion, noting the need for strength. He replies that strength comes from obedience, and obedience requires clarity, and clarity requires distance. The sentences are clean, like his lines. The meaning is hard. Can Better's home darken? He writes of a mission from a god, without naming the god directly. He speaks of balance to be restored, of masks to be removed, of agents who test the faithful by mimicry. Phrases like hidden harms and necessary act appear in tidy handwriting. He still describes scenes, the soft ash of an evening sky, a gate's wood silvered by time, but every scene is now a stage for purpose. You can feel him live inside a script that only he can read. Meanwhile, the work stays fierce. He stands in the remains of a small church and draws an arch with cross-hatching so fine you lean close to see it. The pencil taps, lifts, taps. He builds a world grain by grain. It holds him, and it holds his thought. His control is not gone. It's concentrated. Something else grows too. Vigilance. He watches corners. He shifts seats. He studies faces, not for character, but for signs. Her cough becomes a cue. Her scrape of boot on stone becomes a signal. He hears patterns in carts, rolling by wheel, pause, wheel, and he reads them. The guide, a practical man, offers stories to widen the frame. Shepherds, markets, odd travellers who claim to see spirits in dust. He listens, then extracts from each tale a rule. The party lodges one night in a low house with a courtyard. Vines trained across a trellis to cut the heat. Lamps make small islands of light. He sits apart, copying a carved lintel into his book, while you and the patron's son play at conversation. A cat slides along the wall. He looks up, follows its path, and relaxes a fraction when it passes through and nothing happens. His relief is small but visible. You walk with him at dusk near a pool where reeds clack softly. He says the city presses too close, that edges blur where there are many people, and that blurred edges are where agents work best. He uses that word as if he's naming a class of insect. He is not cruel, not angry. He is certain. Certainty hardens like fired clay. You feel it in the way his neck stiffens when the tutor suggests a change of route. On a morning headed toward a site the guide calls sacred, he stops abruptly and asks the patron's son to count steps from a date palm to a low wall. The son humors him. He counts. The number matters to him because he has a chart of numbers that anchor places to acts. He folds the chart into his pocket like a relic. You're close enough to see the tiny script, the neat columns. This is the same hand that once wrote stage cues for Shakespeare's scenes. Now it writes cues for something you can't see. There's a quiet conversation between the tutor and the patron's son over bread. They don't want to send alarm home, but they agree. The letters must be sent ahead of them. A doctor in London will be asked to meet the party. They plan to return him gently. They will say rest. They will say family. They will say so the work can be better when he resumes. You hear the care in their planning. You also hear worry breathing under each word. He begins to speak of agents near the group. Not many. One or two. And clever. He names no one. He checks faces when he thinks no one sees him. He checks yours. You hold his gaze and give him the calm you have. He archives it, then moves on. He has lists to adjust, instructions to tune. He's building a method. Still, a change of weather brings a lighter moment. A breeze cuts the heat, and he traces a window molding with a care that sounds like affection in the line. He jokes once about the guide's hat end. Everyone smiles too quickly. Relief is loud. It fades when a cart rattles by. and the wheel pattern fixes him again. Wheel, wheel, pause. He holds the count in his mouth. You watch him at prayer sites, not praying, but ranking. This shrine feels arranged, that one feels broken. He approves of arrangement. He disapproves of brokenness that seems deliberate. He says some breaks are honest. Time does that. Other breaks signal interference. He says interference has a source. He doesn't have to say the name from stone. You hear it anyway. A low hum at the base of every sentence. One evening, under a thin moon, he takes you aside and asks for help with a choice. His tone is calm. He outlines a test he's devised to reveal an agent. The test is simple, he says, and harmless. It involves watching how a man enters a room and whether he touches a certain side of a doorway. You ask if error is possible. He says error is always possible, but not here. Here the rules are clear. He thanks you for listening and walks away with a steadiness that makes your chest tighten. By now, the party's laughter is thinner. Even the guide goes quiet. The tutor writes in his own book phrases that show caution and care. He remains industrious, delusions fixed, judgment impaired in certain domains, gentle in manner. You read over a shoulder and feel the shape of the path ahead. Return him. Seek help. When the decision is finally made, England, now you feel something unclench in the group. Plans are set. Routes retraced. He accepts the news as if he had already factored it into his charts. The work, he says, will continue at home. You hear a tone in work that bends the word toward something beyond paint. The last days on these roads are quiet. He walks, counts, watches. He draws fiercely. He eats little. He sleeps less. Certainty hardens. When the caravan turns toward the coast, you glance back at hills holding ruined arches like open mouths. You carry a cold thought. The name from stone has become a command, and the command is coming with you. Return voyage. The long unravel, the coast lifts and falls behind you as the ship leans into open water. Cabins are small. Rails sing when ropes tighten. He stands on deck with his portfolio close, as if the sea might want to borrow a page. The decision is made. Home, rest, family, a doctor's eye. The words sit like careful cargo in the minds of the tutor and the patron's son. He nods at each plan with a politeness that hides a private arithmetic. The work, he says, is not finished. You hear the hinge in that word. Confinement amplifies belief. On land, space let worry drain into horizons. Here, edges press in. The sea and the ship create a drum of patterns waves, slapping wood, chain links knocking, pulleys creaking. You watch him listen. You watch him sort the sounds as if they're code. Wheel, wheel, pause returns as rope, snap. He stands still to count. He writes numbers on his cuff, then wipes them off with a thumb. Satisfied or wary, you can't tell. P sketches with furious control to keep his hands ahead of his mind. The pages look like nets pulled tight, cross-hatching so fine it almost hums. He draws the profile of a coil of rope with the care of a portraitist. Anchors, cleats, the waterline biting into hull. He's mapping the ship to tame it. You feel a pulse of relief each time the pencil moves. When it stops, the cabin fills with a different pressure. Attempts to reason meet a locked courtesy. The tutor places a hand on his shoulder and talks about sleep, about how the mind needs rest after great input. He agrees aloud. In his eyes, an old ledger keeps tally. Inputs, outputs, tasks pending. The patron's son tries jokes. He smiles, then glances toward the mast, where a flag snaps at intervals as if signaling. He watches the gaps between snaps and softens, only when the wind steadies into a pattern he prefers. Nights press hardest. The ship breathes a low groan as timber flexes and he hears it as note and counter-note. You lie awake in the top bunk while he sits at the small table, building a study of a lantern's metal cage line by line. He holds his breath to steady the stroke, then exhales only when the angle locks true. That control still soothes him. It soothes you, too, though you're not the one needing the anchor. Meals are short and less frequent. He avoids soups and anything he didn't see prepared. You watch him unwrap bread he saved from shore and eat it dry. Slow, eyes lifted when a plate clinks on another in a rhythm that fails his test. He changes seats without comment. He notices who follows. He notes who doesn't. He marks the time when a sailor passes twice in too few minutes. You stand with him at the stern one morning. The wake writes a bright path. He traces it in the air with a finger as if correcting its curve. He speaks in a low voice about agents who crowd at thresholds, doors, river mouths, harbors. He says the sea is one great threshold, and thus full of test and threat. He says it calmly, as a man might describe whether then a small mercy, a long, even swell, and a steady breeze. He laughs at the tutor's story about a schoolboy who copied Latin mistakes with such care that the errors became a style. For a few minutes, the ship is only a ship. The laugh fades when a pulley squeals twice, and not 3 times. He tenses again, as if a door he'd closed just swung open in a draught. In the cramped cabin, he organizes tools with a precision that bears strains. Brushes in a row by size, nibs aligned by nib width, papers weighted at corner. He writes a list, work to be done upon return. The items are not all paintings, you see that. Some are blank lines he intends to fill later. He pauses at the top of the page and writes, "Correct what is near." He stares at the words until the ink dries deep and glossy. You try gentle questions. What specifically needs correction? He answers with a structure, not a name. There are roles, he says, and counter-roles. There are masts and the need to remove them. He talks about tests that reveal true face. He talks about duty in quiet tones. He never raises his voice. It's the calm that unnerves you most. The tutor takes him aside in the corridor where the boards narrow. He speaks of doctors in London who are patient and discreet. He mentions rest in a place with gardens. He doesn't say asylum. He says health. The word lands softly. He nods and thanks him and asks a question about routes from the dock to home. Who will meet them? Who will carry which bag? He is tracing thresholds again. The tutor answers because there's nothing else to do but be kind and precise. Rain lashes for a day. The ship rolls. Seasickness tears control from the most ordered mind. He rides it grimly, face pale, eyes fixed on a knot in the bulkhead. You sit near, useless except as a quiet body in a quiet chair. When the storm clears, he goes on deck and studies the sky like a text. He breathes through his nose, slow, counting. When you ask how he is, he says, aligned, and taps twice on the rail. He vows again that the work isn't finished. There's a difference in tone now. Less hope, more vow. He says it while looking past you toward land he can't yet see. You carry that sentence down the ladder into sleep and wake with it in your mouth. Arrival forms up as a plan with steps, dock, porters, a hired carriage, home, then a doctor's call. You hear it repeated so none of you will forget. He hears it too, and places it within his own plans. Home becomes a stage for crises because it's where the nearest threshold lies. He won't say that. You feel it anyway when he checks the time of docking against a tide table and smiles at some private convergence. The coastline appears as a darker line under cloud. He tightens his grip on the portfolio. He takes one last page and adds a final band of cross-hatching to the study of the lantern cage. The cage glows with trapped light. He closes the book and presses his palm to the cover as if sealing something inside. While the harbor wakes, bells ring in their known patterns. He listens, head tilted, and relaxes when the bells match an order he respects. A gull's cry snags the moment, and he flinches so slightly you might miss it if you weren't already tuned to every twitch. The group gathers near the gangway. The tutor meets his eyes and nods. The patron's son smiles, earnest and tired. You stand close enough to hear each breath. Home isn't refuge. Not yet. It's a series of doors. And he has come to see doors as tests. Homecoming, London's familiar streets, a mind at war. London rises with its old mix of soot and bustle, and you feel the ground steady under your boots. He breathes in the city like a familiar chord. The dock's smell gives way to damp brick and horse sweat as you cross narrow streets. His father waits with relief worn plain on his face. He folds his son in, careful, like handling a fragile parcel he knows too well. He thanks the tutor. He shakes the patron's son's hand and says they did right. Then he turns to his boy and suggests tea at home. The rooms are mush as he left them. A writing desk, shelves of prints, a window that takes the day in slant. He sets his portfolio down with a reverence that tells you it's both shield and shrine. His father moves in gentle lanes, offering tea, naming small plans. A slow walk by the river, a visit to a friendly doctor, nothing dramatic. He answers with ease, polite, grateful. You see him look at the door frame and measure the space as if gauging a threshold. Doctor visits begin. The first is a man who has words like mania and delusion in his bag along with tonics and counsel. He speaks softly about rest, about avoiding stimulation, about regular meals. He does not yet mention places with locked doors. He writes a note. Overwork, strain, heat exposure, possible religious fixation. Recommend quiet. His father listens, nods, and asks what he can do. The doctor suggests route walks, reading light. The son smiles and says he has always liked route. At the dinner table, every clink starts to sound coded. You hear the fork strike, china tap, pause and, watch his eyes flick toward the mantel clock. He keeps his tone even, asks after neighbors, after small matters of rent and rates, after the weather. As if the talk itself were a veil hung to hide the ledger in his lap, he eats, but he tracks each sound. His father reaches across to pass bread and touches his hand a beat longer than needed. The son leaves his hand there, then withdraws as if remembering a rule. He grows wary of visits. Friends who come to offer welcome are turned away with courtesy. He's resting, he's at work. He insists to his father on secrecy about the tour, about what he saw. You hear the word agent again, now with a lowercase tone, woven into sentences that otherwise sound like normal domestic thought. He walks at night, longer and longer loops. He returns with his collar damp and his eyes bright with a focus that doesn't include the room he's entered. His father suggests a trip to the countryside to calm him. The plan is modest. 2 days, fresh air, a familiar path near fields and water. The son agrees. He speaks of air in terms you could mistake for simple pleasure if you didn't hear the weight of tests beneath. The morning of departure, he checks objects in his pocket knife for fruit, pencil, folded paper, and aligns them along a line only he can see. He takes up the jewel-handled knife with a small nod. His father watches and says nothing. Meanwhile, the doctor adjusts his phrases. He visits again and notes that delusions appear fixed. Sleep is broken, appetite uncertain, affect courteous. He recommends supervised rest and presses for a family member to remain nearby at all times. The father agrees and says he will be near. He is near. Preview walk with them through London's familiar streets. The son noticing thresholds, shop doors, alley mouths, gate posts like pressure points on a body. He notes faces, turns, and the timing of a lamplighter's steps. He speaks softly to his father about balance. The father answers with human things, a story from childhood, a recipe remembered, the way rain in summer smells like warm stone. The son smiles at each, then moves the talk back to order and its keepers. Put home. The portfolio opens on the table only for short minutes. He shows a page, lantern, cage, cross-hatched into gloam, closes it as if light could escape. He sharpens pencils with the fruit knife and studies the blade's clean edge. His father, who knows his son's hands, watches the way the blade sits there like a thought that's been given metal. He asks to cut the bread with it, and the son hands it over with a pause and a glance that reads the gesture as a test passed. We notice the small rituals multiply. He aligns items on the mantel. He lingers at a window and traces invisible grids on the pane. He whispers numbers and then stops, catching himself, and smiles as if to say he won't give you cause for concern. He offers to make tea and measures water by count rather than by sight. He brings the cup to his father with both hands, a ceremony of care and control. At night, he sits at the small desk and draws. The line is taut, exact. He renders a local bridge as if it were a fortress, each stone locked by tiny strokes. The drawing is beautiful and airless. You hear the scratch of the nib as a kind of breath. When his father peeks in, he looks up and says he's improving the scene. He says it gently, as if asking permission to live inside the paper longer. A neighbor greets them on a walk and mentions a sermon he heard about order in the universe. The son asks for the text. The neighbor laughs and waves it off. The son doesn't laugh. He watches the neighbor's wrist as it moves through space and relaxes only when the hand falls to a side he favors. His father thanks the neighbor and steers the talk toward gardens. The son conducts an invisible inventory of signs and then nods, satisfied for now. The planned trip grows near. The father prepares a basket with modest care, bread, cheese, apples. He chooses a path they both know. He believes fresh light can untie knots that tight rooms pull tighter. He believes in contact, in calm talk, in simple acts that bring a man back from ledges to kitchens and hedges and common paths. He doesn't know the name from stone and how it sits in his son's chest like a key. The doctor's last visit before the trip ends with a promise to call again after. He suggests the father avoid argument, avoid contradiction, avoid sudden moves. He suggests the son not be left alone near water. He says all of this as if naming habits could lasso fate. He leaves with a hand on the father's shoulder that says, courage, and also be careful. Few sleep lightly that night and wake to the sound of steps in the hall, measured and soft. Dawn pushes a pale band across the floor. He stands in the doorway, calm, and says it's time to walk. His father joins him, hat in hand, eyes tired but kind. They step into the street, two figures in a world that believes in morning. You follow, quiet, close enough to hear breath and the brush of coat on coat. London's familiar streets let them go with no warning. The fields beyond weight. The mind at war walks beside a father who still hopes gentleness can win. To patricide, a quiet evening. Then impact you walk with them beyond the last houses where hedges open to a low field. The light is even, the kind that lays no sharp shadows. A path threads along a ditch. They speak softly. The father points out a familiar ash tree, a stile they crossed when he was small. He tries to seat the day in memory. The son listens, nods, and answers in short, steady phrases. His eyes keep slipping to boundaries, fence, lines, gateposts, the curve where a path meets a lane. Stakes sit in the air like held breath. Family, trust, the hope that a gentle walk can steady a mind. The fear that belief, once hardened, doesn't bend. You hear birds. You hear a cart distant on a road. You hear their feet on the dry path. He adjusts the basket on his arm and shifts the small knife from one pocket to another, a gesture that looks like comfort. They stop by a hedge and share an apple. He takes the knife out and peels with clean, practiced cuts. The father watches his hands the way a carpenter watches, a joinery respectful, alert. He offers half the fruit and holds the blade steady as the piece is taken. The small civility lands like a relief. They eat in silence, looking out across low ground to a smear of water that reflects a pale sky. They talk again. The father asks about Rome and Athens in tones meant to open wider spaces. The son answers with faxed columns counted, angles noted, the color of stone in noonlight. Then he speaks of signs, quietly. He describes how patterns gather at thresholds. He says some masks hide harms, and harms must be set right. The father listens and tries to make a bridge from those words to common care. He says home is a threshold too, and it welcomes. He says nothing needs setting right here except a stiff back from work and the habit of long nights. You feel the hinge. The son's voice stays calm, but the meaning tightens. He thanks his father for patience. He says patience is a virtue that sometimes covers danger. He says a test can show what patience hides. He looks at the water, then at his father's face, and then, as if to himself, he nods once. Action compresses to small motions. A walk resumes, a turn toward a copse where the path narrows. The father steps ahead to hold a branch aside. The son follows, slides the knife into his palm with an ease learnt in kitchens and studios. He speaks one last time words about duty, about setting order, about being chosen to enact what others fear. His tone is tender and terrible in its calm. Then impact, a quick move, a strike delivered with a precision that once belonged to line and now belongs to harm. The father gasps, tries to speak, reaches. There's the sound of breath torn short, and the small, shocked silence that follows any blow meant in certainty. You try to shout, and the field takes your voice and thins it. The son steps back, eyes wide, chest heaving once, then settling. He looks at the knife as if at a tool that has fulfilled its use. He kneels. He says words that sound like prayer, but they're ledger words: balance, remove, restore. He stands, looks around as if expecting the air to shift. When it doesn't, he takes quick stock time, direction, sightlines, and moves. The basket is left where it fell. The knife disappears into a pocket. He walks fast, then faster, toward a lane that bends out of view. You hold the scene like a hot object and cannot put it down. Flight begins in fragments. A lane, a gate, a sprint across a yard. He knows routes. He has walked at night and recorded turns. He takes a path that leads to a road where a coach passes twice a day. He waits with a stillness that makes him invisible, then boards with a coin and a lowered head. He's not hiding like a thief. He moves like a man inside a plan. The coach rattles toward the city. Immediate aftermath gathers behind him. A passerby in the field finds the father and runs for help. Neighbors arrive. Messages are sent. The basket is noted. The cut is noted. A doctor is summoned and can't reverse what's done. The talk in rooms moves from shock to inquiry. People say his name and then lower their voices as if the name itself could fray. A constable asks when he left, what he wore, which way he turned. You follow him in thought as he reaches London with daylight left to spend. He slips into a room, gathers papers, coins, a few small tools, and a sketchbook. He writes a short line you won't see until later. Work advanced. He changes his coat. He moves again, aiming for the docks. France is near and far at once. He means to cross. He means to keep moving. Rumors rise like mist ahead of him. An artist returned from the East. Odd talk, long walks. A father, anxious. He hears none of it. He stands at a ticket window, pays, and boards. The Channel takes him in with its usual chop. He faces the sea, jaw set, eyes on the wet boards, counting with the rhythm of the waves. He whispers the name from stone once, and then holds his tongue. Ed, the English shore, shrinks. Orders tighten around the fact of harm. Messages go out. Descriptions fixed. Authorities on both sides are told to watch for a man with careful hands and a look that doesn't rest. On the French side, a cafe waits with its glare of glass, its small cups, its habit of afternoon ease. He will enter it soon, and the tension you carry will change shape. For now, the field and the path hold still in your mind, the apple, the branch, the choice set like a line the hand once drew and never erased. Arrest in France, the calf and the razor. You arrive with him in a port town where the wind tastes of salt and metal. Streets tilt toward the water, and shutters throw thin shade over narrow lanes. He walks as if he's rehearsed it, steps counted, turns chosen. A cafe waits near a square with a bright window that catches noon. Inside, cups click, spoons stir, and the hum of talk makes a soft veil across the room. He chooses a table by the glass. The light lays a clean band across his hands. He orders something small and doesn't touch it. He studies the door, the mirror behind the counter, the angle of a man's hat, the rhythm of a server's steps, patterns, bills, patterns accused. He shifts his chair half an inch and sets his sketchbook on the table as if art could still shape the air. A stranger returns his glance. Nothing notable. Tired face, a traveller's coat, a razor case peeking from a pocket like a small instrument. That detail locks him. The razor reads as signal and blade and proof. The word agent moves from thought to target. He reases with quiet purpose. You feel the room tighten. Action breaks the surface. He steps to the stranger, says a few words in a calm English sentence. The other man doesn't understand, and reaches. The razor flashes out, quick, small, a thing meant for beards, and now turned toward a throat. Glass throws light. The cafe inhales. He is stopped by Badi's, more than by will hands on his wrists, weight at his shoulders, the sudden grip of many who, even without the story, know danger when it stiffens a spine. You're pressed against the window with the crowd, the glare sharp on your eye. The razor clatters to the floor. A server kicks it under a chair. Someone shouts for the police in clipped French. He tries to explain, and his words, set in the old order of duty, fail in a room that didn't ask for theology. He insists the act was correction. They hear only attack. He softens his voice, but the frenzy has already drawn its circle. The weight of many hands settles him into a chair and binds his arm. He looks at the window, then at the mirror, then at the doorway, and makes a small inventory of exits, as if proximity could loosen rope. It can't. The stranger, shaken and pale, presses a cloth to a thin line of blood along his jaw. It's not grave, but it's enough for the law to enter with a sure step. Uniforms arrive. Questions come fast and formal. Papers are requested. He gives his name. The name lands with a dull thud. An English artist, wild-eyed, detained. That's how the first notes will read. He answers with courtesy even now, asking that his portfolio be kept dry, asking that his sketchbook not be bent. He repeats that he acted under instruction. The officers look at each other and mark a word that fits better and reports deranged. Identity fixes quickly. He is who he says he is, and that makes the news move. A messenger runs. A telegraph sings. Across water, London does. The father's death by knife fact now linding. Ink meets the sun's name in a ledger that doesn't care about nuance. You feel the weight of those two lines meeting. It's heavy and cold. Delicate path tilts. The scene is not tried as a simple crime because the story underneath it refuses to shrink. Reports from England, letters from companions, and the cafe's own witness accounts braid into a picture of a man in the grip of fixed belief. The French officials hold him, then arrange to hand him to English care. Care, not punishment, becomes the word, even as metal rings his wrists and rooms locked behind him. He spends a night in a narrow cell with a high window that shows a crooked scrap of sky. He sits on a bench and aligns his breathing to the shadows crawl along the wall. You stand at the bars and hear his low voice carry the old turns balance, order, agent, slide beads. He isn't raging, he's arranging. He asks for paper and gets none. He asks for silence and receives the corridor's coughs and the scrape of boots on stone. He tilts his head to fit the noise into pattern. He always does. In the morning they move him. The cafe returns to coffee and soft talk and a story that will be told for years, with hand motions showing a small blade and a sudden lunge. The stranger will point at his jaw and say, "It was close." He'll lower his voice when he says, "The man looked calm." Calm is what rattled him most. Calm turned quick. On the quay, he stands guarded and watches gulls tilt on air. He speaks gently to an officer about how thresholds collect tests. And the officer watches the sea and nods because he wants the day to pass. When the packet boat noses in, he steps aboard between two men who keep firm hands on his arms. He doesn't resist. Resistance doesn't suit his theory. Submission fits the part where agents escort you toward the next stage. You feel the channel under him again, that old chop, that bell at the harbor mouth. And you think of the field and the apple and the breath that failed to carry a shout. The news will travel faster than this small craft. By the time he touches English soil, a path will be set questioning, declaration, and a transfer that places him where locked doors are called treatment. In the cafe, the window still throws glare across the floor. The razor is retrieved and cleaned. The chair he toppled is set upright. People resume their seats and speak of luck and close calls. They don't know his drawings. They don't know the way he holds a line until it hums. They only know a brief, sharp scene and a man whose eyes read patterns where they saw steam and glass. Back on the boat, he watches the wake write its temporary script and then vanish. He looks at his empty hands and flexes his fingers as if they miss a brush. The officers stand steady. The wind presses the coat against his ribs. He whispers one old name and then closes his mouth, as if saving words for rooms where words will be taken down. Care awaits, so do years. Bedlam opens its door. Bethlem Hospital, first Asylum years. You reach London with him under guard, and doors close in the name of care. Bethlem stands with thick walls and rules that sound gentle because they're practiced. Admission is brisk. Papers pass, hands. A clerk writes his name in a ledger under a heading that joins two ideas no family ever wants to meet: criminal and lunatic. A physician takes notes while watching his face. He answers calmly, even courteously, and sets his portfolio down as if it's a friend who'll be allowed to stay. The regimen declares itself in the first hours. wards divided by risk, routines that carry weight like rails, rise at a set time, wash, breakfast in rows, yard time in measured turns, labor where possible, conversation observed, lights low at night, doors with keys that turn out of sight of those inside. You walk the hallway with muted steps. The air carries lye, tea, and ink. He scans door frames, the way he scanned temple lintels, finding thresholds and tracking their tests. At intake he's questioned about belief. He speaks of order and of duties attached to order. He does not hide the name from stone. He doesn't shout it. He says it like a job title. The doctor writes, fixed delusion, coherent speech, no intoxication, courteous. A second note, marked industry, risk when belief intersects with opportunity. His father's death sits in a line of ink that nobody lingers on aloud in his hearing. The facts are kept close but firm. The first days offer limited materials, paper rationed, graphite stubs, a small brush when a staff member stands near. He accepts the limits, the way he accepts any rule that presents as order. He asks to work. They encourage work because work in this place is believed to order the mind by ordering the hands. Victorian psychiatry frames it simply moral treatment, structure, routine, useful labor. He is built for this. He is also bent by something structure cannot undo. You stand by a small desk assigned to him. The grain is scarred by other hands. He sits, breathes, and begins. The first line is slow, a test. The second line commits. He falls into cross-hatching like prayer, tiny strokes, patient pressure, a field of marks that settles his chest. He draws what's available, a jug, a window lattice, a shoe. The detail is restless and serene at once. Each fine mark locks a corner of the world so it can't tilt. You hear the nib scratch as if it were a metronome that refuses surprise. Starve, watch, and take notes, one writes. Industrious, neat, deferential, delusions unshaken. He thanks attendants by name and stands when the doctor enters. He resists nothing except the idea that the voice has no claim on him that remains. It sits behind his calm like a steady drum. When a shout rises from another ward, he looks up and tilts his head, passing noise into signal. He chooses not to respond. The choice is control. Control is his anchor. A small turning point arrives with permission to keep materials at his desk under lock. An attendant unlocks the drawer in the morning and relocks it at night. The first morning he lays tools out in a neat array and breathes like a craftsman entering a familiar shop. Pen and ink, a few watercolors, a rag. He starts building a world small enough to master. Early works inside are miniature, precise, threaded with plant stems and tiny faces that crowd edges with intent but not chaos. He handles space as if it were a moral problem, how to assign order where pressures bend. You lean close to a small scene of figures among leaves. It's not yet fairies in their future throng, but you can feel the habit forming the joy of a figure an eighth of an inch high, posed just right. The delight in a seed head rendered until it glows. Detail isn't fuss in his hands, it's law. While he works, interviews continue. Doctors use words of the day. moral insanity, religious mania, homicidal monument. You listen to those terms and keep them in the period where they belong. They try leeches less often now. They prefer patience and watchfulness, restraint only when needed. He helps them because he is steady and he likes rules. He walks in the yard with measured steps and avoids other men's spirals by counting bricks. You sense how the ward shapes ours into a loop that becomes a life. Breakfast, desk, yard, desk, tea, desk, bed. The loop holds him. In holding him, it also narrows the world to what can be understood by crosshatch and placement. A nurse notes that he sleeps better when he completes a drawing late, and worse when he's stopped before a section is resolved. Staff learn to time orders to the end of a pattern, not the middle. That small kindness makes a large difference. Visitors come sometimes. A brother sits with him and studies a small watercolor. They talk about family without touching the hard core. He asks after the house plants, the window, the street noise. He wants facts he can place. When the visitor leaves, he returns to the desk and adds a leaf he'd left blank, then breathes easier. Completion is the only relief that sticks. He begins to make images that reach beyond jugs and shoes. Allegory enters the room. The first of the passions glint at the edge, subtle figures embodying states, anger, hatred, love. Grief features set to a key that few can play without slipping into melodrama. He threads them with a restraint that refines excess into emblem. Even here, even now, his theatre training shows. You sense he's staging a mind to itself. Meanwhile, staff weigh whether art is symptom or salve. They argue softly in the hallway. Both readings coexist. The superintendent, newly in post, is inclined to permit more work under supervision. He believes that material and time in the hands of a man like this yield calm and record. A record matters. It lets the outside see what the inside does with ours. A small brush becomes a ritual tool. He cleans it with care, wipes the ferrule, reshapes the hairs with lips, sets it down, aligned with the paper edge. You watch this 3 times in an afternoon and never feel repetition. It's ceremony. Ceremony is safe. He remains polite. He remains unshakable. When asked again about the act that brought him here, he speaks in the same tone he uses for composition. The act followed order. He regrets distress. He does not retract the logic. The doctor writes that line down because it captures the paradox. Kindness housed with harm, both held in a single frame. You hold that frame too, and it resists easy claims. Winter presses at pains. He draws frost on glass, as if tracing the mind's own branching. He copies patterns from memory temple ceilings, leaf wreaths. Brickwork into the page hums with a micro-order that soothes him, and by extension, the room. Attendants pause to watch. One says later that the drawings quieted more than the man who made them. Permission widened slowly. Watercolor days arrive. A tiny green delays as he mixes until it matches the plant he remembers. Jewel tones begin to seed the paper. The miniature worlds grow denser. You feel him rehearse the future on small sheets, a stage with no sky. Figures set like chess, thistles as spears, seed caps as helmets. The language is forming under supervision and safety. The bed is made, the desk is cleared, the drawer locks. He sleeps. The entry in the book changes by a line transferred, when ready, to a new asylum with grounds and studios better suited to long care. Broadmoor is being prepared for cases like his industrious, courteous, locked-in belief. For now, these first years prove to truths. Belief can harden past argument, and art can give a mind a place to stand. You walk the hallway one more time and feel the rhythm settle. Keys turn, footsteps fade. Inside a small room, a small brush rests, aligned, art as treatment, materials, limits, and permission. Victorian care frames a simple creed, order through work. You hear it in the ward rules and see it in the desk they give him a square of wood, a locked drawer, a schedule that repeats until it becomes air. He meets this creed like an old colleague. Structure doesn't scare him, it steadies him. Within limits, he can build. At first, access is spare, pen on certain days, watercolor only with an attendant present. Later, a little oil, rationed, because oil climbs beyond paper and asks for time and space the ward must measure. He accepts the boundaries with a sincerity that reads as relief. The first layer of cross-hatching becomes a ritual. He holds his breath to lay the line true. He lets it go when a corner seals. The room quiets around that rhythm. Victorian psychiatry names this moral treatment. No shocks today, no purges. Instead, steady hours, modest tasks, the discipline of the hand guiding the mind toward calm. In him, the theory finds a near-perfect vessel. He turns the simplest objects into exercises in poise. A jug shifts from thing to study, a window lattice to a geometry problem solved by patience. Attendants learn his cues, when to let the line finish. Interruptions cut clean. They time them with care. Soon the themes inside his head look for forms that can hold them. The passions emerge, not as wild outbursts, but as arranged faces, seated impulses wearing emblems. Anger is balanced by restraint in the tilt of a jaw. Hatred holds a blade but points it inward. Love looks sideways, wary. Grief sits still, not theatrical but weighty. He composes like a stage manager with every marker taped to the floor. You sense the theater training move under the hospital light, with staff debate in the corridor. Is this symptom or self? They keep their voices even because the wards carry sound. One argues that the multiplicity of figures, the ornate detail, the insistence on completion all prove the mind's fix. Another says the same traits keep the day safe. Obsession redirected into craft. The superintendent doesn't force a choice. He lets both readings hold. He widens permission, slowly more paper, a steadier supply of ink, supervised color, because the outcomes are plain. The work meets the man where he lives. He writes small notes on the margins to guide himself. They're not manifestos, they're counters of time and layer. Wash one, dry, hatch, pause, deepen, rest. He treats rest as a layer too. You see him step away from the desk, walk to the window, align the frames vertical with a crack in the plaster, breathe, and return. The cycle repeats. It's a time. When he gets oils, the scale still stays modest. There's no room for grand canvases. Not yet. He primes boards that can fit a drawer. He grinds a green until it matches the leaf he memorized, testing it on a scrap adjusting with a whisper of yellow, nodding when the tone sits where he wants it. Jewel tones arrive like cautious guests. They don't shout, they gleam. The ward notices the effect. On days when he finishes a section a leaf bed concluded, a figure's shoe resolved sleep comes easier. On days when a nurse moves him mid-hatch for a meal, the night stretches adjustments follow. Meals slide by minutes. The finish line is granted. His courtesy never slips. He thanks by name, steps back when asked, hands over tools without sulk. But the core belief doesn't move either. When doctors circle back to the act that brought him here, he answers with the same calm. It was duty. He regrets pain. He does not alter the line. The notes record the paradox. Treatment can order hours. Treatment cannot erase a story lodged in stone. You lean over a small panel as he layers wash on wash, and then lifts the surface with a point to make a grass blade flash. It's meticulous. It's also generous, in its way, to the eye that will come later. He is building a world where the viewer has to lean in, slow down, and match his care. In a place that takes control from people, he makes a pocket where control returns ethical, in its demand for patience rather than force. Meanwhile, permission extends to subjects beyond objects and emblems. He draws scenes of fancy that look like games until you feel the rule inside them. He sets figures in glades with no sky. He crops the frame low, so the land itself becomes stage floor. He selects plants not at random, but by role. Thistle as threat, seedcap as helmet, burdock as shield. Each choice soothes because each choice is precise. Attendants start keeping examples. They paste small labels on the backdate, medium, notes about behavior that day. These objects become a quiet ledger of treatment, evidence that ours can bear fruit other than pacing and worry. A visitor shows interest and is told gently about limits. Look, don't speak too much. Don't promise things the ward can't give. The visitor nods and stares and signs his name in a book he didn't come to sign. The boundaries remain firm. Materials live in the drawer. Keys turn. A brush never sleeps in water. He follows every rule and makes more for himself. Tiny personal codes that attend to angle and pause. Even his cleaning of tools becomes liturgy. Wipe Pharrell, shape hair, set flat, align to edge. The ritual is not empty. It tells his nerves what time it is. There's a day when a nurse asks whether the art helps. He thinks, then says, it holds. That word carries weight. To hold is not to cure. To hold is to keep together. The nurse writes it down because it explains more than a treatise. You keep it, too. He writes once, in a small, neat hand, that art is the work he can do without harm. The doctor underlines that sentence. It shifts nothing and everything. It justifies the extra paper, the late light. It frames permission not as indulgence, but as safety. Transfer begins as a topic rather than an act. Broadmoor is nearly ready. Grounds instead of yards. A studio corner, perhaps. Years to shape one picture without moving it every night. He hears this and breathes out the way he does when a section is done. He isn't leaving belief. He is gaining space. He will carry both the fixed story and the craft that tames its edges. For now, in Bethlem art, as treatment becomes a pact, he brings patience and skill. They bring materials and time. Limits hold like rails. Within them he builds. You stand at his shoulder, counting with him not agents now, but layers, and each count steadies the hand you watch and the room you share. Broadmoor, the long middle of a life. Broadmoor opens like a wide-walled village. The air is cleaner. The grounds stretch in measured greens. Buildings sit with calm intent, brick and slate, laid in lines that prefer order. You walk with him through a gate that clicks shut without malice. The word is care. The reality is locks. He accepts both and looks for the death. The new model Asylum promises steady routines and space. A doctor meets him with notes from Bethlem and a tone that's both firm and kind. Industrious, courteous, delusions, fixed. They place him on a ward suited to men who work and don't break rooms. He nods, listening, filing voice cadence alongside words, and asks when and where he may draw. The doctor says, daily, under supervision, in the wardroom or a small studio corner when ready. You feel the exhale before you hear it. Your steps carry you to that corner, a good window. Light falling from high and clean, a table scarred by use, a chair that doesn't wobble. He touches the sill, the wood cool under his palm, and then seats himself to test the angle of light on paper. Outside, birds cross the sky beyond a wire that runs like a fine line through the view. He notes the wire without flinch. Boundaries, he understands. Routine deepens here until it feels like tide. Wake at a bell. Wash. Breakfast. Walk the grounds inside paths marked by gravel that crunches in a comforting rhythm. Work at the table when the ward quiets. Tea when the kettle signals. Yard again. Back to the table. He moves within these rails as if they were staff lines in music, and his hand plays a part that never wavers. His health steadies. The body likes air and regular food. The hand remains sure. The belief remains, too unshakable. Like a not in-seasoned wood that tools don't erase. Staff diaries capture the paradox with the same 4 phrases in slight variations. Industrious, polite, absorbed, unshakable. He helps attendants with chairs. He thanks by name. He returns to the page and to the figures that keep multiplying in his care. Broadmoor's grounds offer him slow circuits. You walk beside him as he maps them without mapping paper corner. Bench, path, turn, view of distant fields curbed by the perimeter. He marks a pair of crows that visit a elm at the same hour and smiles when they keep the appointment. He prefers patterns that keep their promise. When one morning the crows don't come, his eyes tighten and then soften as he watches a different bird perch and preen in the same place. Substitution that preserves the rule satisfies him. Requests come from within the walls. A warder asks for a likeness to send home. A clerk wants a tidy image of the chapel. He accepts commissions as tasks that set shape to time. He draws faces with patience and without flattery, finding in a jawline the weight of hours, in a brow the simple pride of a job done without fuss. He gives these small portraits to people who are not used to being seen with such care. The gifts travel to mantles where his name is said in kitchens that will never see his canvases. He paints small scenes of fancy between these requests. The glades return. The figures shrink to the size of thumb joints, and stand in precise attitudes that echo theatre and folklore while answering only to his lore. He still writes little notes beside them, sometimes so a sleeve aligns, so a leaf tucks under but less often. The code is now in his hand. He doesn't need to explain it to himself as much. Doctors check in on the core. Do the voices persist? He answers without drama that instruction continues. He doesn't argue or evangelize. He simply refuses to discard the frame. They ask about remorse and receive the line they know. Regret for distress, fidelity to order. They record. They adjust nothing because adjustment lies outside this man's reach and also outside theirs. You notice a shift in scale. Broadmoor's steady time and safer store of materials let panels grow. Not huge, but larger than Bethlem's drawboards. He stretches his attention over wider fields without losing the hum of tiny strokes. Jewel tones move more boldly, numerald, carmine. A sober gold, still precise, still cool to the eye, but richer. He knows how to make a leaf gleam without shouting. He knows how to place a seed cap so it crowns a head with both joke and justice. The studio corner gathers objects that become his private cabinet. Dried thistles, seed pods, small stones, feathers. He turns each into emblem. He studies their structures with a watchmaker's patience and stores their angles for later use. An attendant watches him line 3 thistles across a sill, measure their spines with a brush handle, and smile when the distances echo a harmony only he sees. The attendant later writes that the man smiles when numbers fit. Visitors step into the ward with caution and leave with a tilt of awe. A brother comes, aged a little, and sits with him by the window. They speak of family in clipped phrases and of ordinary things. A neighbor's cart, a leak patched, a nephew's lesson. He offers his brother a small drawing of a path through ferns. The brother holds it as if the paper were warm. You feel the small bridge hold, slender but real. Now and then an outsider patron, doctor from another facility. A curious official asks to see his work. Staff curate the encounter. Look, don't press, marvel, but quietly. He stands aside and lets eyes travel over the tiny armies of figures and stems. He answers questions about technique, not meaning. He names pigments, if asked. He won't decode the theatre of his glades. He lets the surface speak because surface is honest and safe. Meanwhile, the institution's own record keeps a steady drumbeat. No incidents, no threats, no breakages, delusions, unaltered, mood serene, sleep fair when work complete. Appetite better in summer. He ages into these lines, and the lines settle into him. Decades begin to gather without spectacle. Broadmoor becomes the town he lives in, with trees that grow and men who retire and new ones who learn his name on their first day. In this quiet he starts the painting that will define him. The first marks don't announce themselves as a masterpiece. They never do. He tapes a rectangle, tests a ground, and draws guidelines that partition space into a stage with no sky. He sets a figure, then 2, then 6, each with a tusker hand about to strike, a gaze fixed, a posture that suggests a story you'll never fully hear. He works as ever, breath held, stroke placed, breath released. Only the density changes. It thickens like leaf litter on a forest floor, layer upon layer, until your eye walks instead of looks. Staff notice the commitment. He returns to the same board day after day with a fidelity that reads like vow. He tends the scene the way a gardener tends a plot, pruning a leaf here, tucking a stem there, training a tendril to arc just so across a gap. He adds figures at the edges, as if the painting were a crowd that keeps arriving. He keeps a small verse book near, jotting lines that catalogue names and roles, pinning imagery with words, so the world he's making won't slide. Through seasons, through small epidemics that skirt the wards, through uniforms that change cut and clerks who change handwriting styles, he keeps building that stage. Birds cross the window beyond the wire. Bells mark hours. Keys turn. He paints. He paints as if patience were the only coin that still buys time. And in this middle stretch, the long, quiet middle you feel how a life can hold. Belief fixed, body calmer, work deepening until the hand finds a world it can keep. The fairy fella's master stroke, conception. You're with him at the windowed corner in Broadmoor when the idea gathers, not as a flash, but as a slow, sure tide. A new, primed panel waits. He tapes a rectangle with care, sets faint grid lines, and tests a pencil point on the margin. He has a world in mind the size of a human chest and dense enough to hold him for years. He is ready to be held. Orage clues, sit close. A warder who admired his glade scenes asks for something more elaborate, something that could anchor a wall. The request folds into his own bent toward crowd and order. He's long studied fair folk in theatre and tale spirits that let him place human impulse in small, precise borders. They offered drama without the blunt weight of history. They let him be exact and sly at once. The inside name for the project doesn't arrive first. The shape does. A stage of earth, no sky. Figures arranged to enact a scene that points toward a single act withheld. You watch the first grid lines appear, faint but decisive. He maps a midline, then quarters, then smaller cells that let him place a figure with a draftsman's accuracy. He breathes, marks, checks. A tiny world wants a builder who can keep scale without losing life. That's him. He places a low horizon, then drops it further until ground almost fills the frame. The decision is key. No distant vanishing point, no grand air. This will be a press of near things, a theatre floor. Characters multiply, but not as clutters. Each figure has a task, a posture, a line of sight. A tall elder, a jester, a woodman. A child types more than portraits. It's set into a web of intent. He sketches hats that look like seed caps and helmets born from acorn cups. He gives a thistle the weight of a spear and a dock leaf the calm of a banner. You lean in and see how plant parts become armory and costume. Nothing is random. A burr is a shield, a husk is a drum, a cobweb is a sash. The conversion from plant to prop is both joke and lore. He begins to name them, not on the face of the picture, but in a small notebook he keeps to the side. Names anchor roles so the array won't slide in his mind between sessions. Some titles ring with folklore, others with private puns. He isn't writing literature. He's pinning butterflies, keeping taxonomy straight so the crowd can breathe without scrambling. He writes verses short, clipped, like a playbill that keeps the cast from blurring. The rhymes are serviceable, the function clear. Language holds place, like string wound round pegs. Central to the scene sits a promise, a single master stroke. He models the moment as a ceremony that leads to one decisive act. The blade that will fall isn't swung here. It's held, anticipated, weighed by many eyes. He tests compositions where the act happens. Each time, the scene collapses. Certainty kills drama. He learns what theatre always knew. The withheld blow binds attention. He chooses to pause the world before the cut. Layers begin, underdrawing in light pencil. Over it, a first wash thin, cool, to set general tones. He lets it dry, then returns with a tiny brush and stipples leaf surfaces until they gleam. He uses jewel tones, but never floods. He tucks color into cells like enamel. It's patient work that asks a steady hand and a steady breath. He has both. He builds crusts of texture so fine that the eye can't skim. It has to walk. Each step is a placed dot, a short line, a stroke that answers a neighbor-like mosaic. The composition grows outward. Edges don't sit idle. He populates borders with figures who do not look in, but across, as if the painting continues beyond frame. The stage effect strengthens. No sky means no escape. You feel the compression. It isn't cruel. It's focused. He wants you near. He wants you complicit in the pause. He returns to the grid often, checking alignments so that sight lines converge on the withheld act. Lances point, fingers point, eyes point. Even the angle of a thistle's spine leans you inward. He draws tiny foreshortenings that would mock a less exact hand. A fairy foot planted on a seed, toe splayed to take balance, reads as solid as a boot on a plank. He cares about weight at miniature scale. That is part of the spell. The scene must feel heavy enough to hold your gaze and light enough to float inside a mind. Buses expand in the notebook. He scribbles them at his desk, then copies fair when the day ends, folding the page and tucking it beside the panel. The list of names becomes a map of intention. He's writing to remember, but also to insist that each figure's task is moral as well as theatrical. The old training in emblem returns. A fool is never only a fool. A crown is never only a crown. He layers meanings without ever tipping into chaos. He can't abide chaos. Staff notice the devotion. Attendants time tea so he can finish a cluster before rising. A doctor stands back and sees that the picture keeps the man where talk can't. He notes the paradox again. Delusion fixed, labor exemplary. Permission widens to a steady slot of morning and afternoon at the panel, with breaks to rest the eye. He honors the breaks if they fall at a seam. If not, they wait. You feel the years slip into the paint. Seasons pass the window. Uniforms change. A new superintendent signs a line in the ledger with a different hand. He remains with the same board. Edges deepen. Figures accrue detail. A cap gains stipple. A beard gains strands. A leaf gains veins upon veins. He delays satisfaction by design, always leaving a small section unsealed so tomorrow has a ledge to grip. This is stamina made visible. The crown of the project, the masterstroke, stays reserved. He paints the preface to it with the attention of a surgeon preparing an incision. He balances the crowd so that anticipation hums, not screams. He rehearses in miniature. On scraps, he tests a blade's angle in light and in shadow. Each time, The painted cut looks too loud, too final. He returns to pause. Meanwhile, the culture outside Broadmoor tilts toward fairy menu illustrations, theatre tableau, poems, but his world isn't sweet. Charm and edge share the stage. He has known what a blade can do. He knows that ceremony around a blow shapes a community for good or harm. The painting holds that knowledge without stating it. He lets symbols carry what he will not say. Years stack, layers build like leaf litter. The surface takes on a quiet gloss from repeated touch. Attendants swap shifts and still talk in low voices about the picture that never ends. He hears them and smiles, not offended. Endless isn't the point. Right is, he will stop when the pause is tuned so cleanly that your breath holds without conscious choice. He sets the brush down at day's end, aligns it to the panel edge, and sits back. The crowd looks frozen and alive at once. The blade has not fallen. Your chest is a held note. He watches you watch, and in that mutual pause, you understand the choice he's made. To make suspense itself the subject, to stretch a second across years, to build a stage where control can live without harm. The fairy fella's masterstroke, construction and meaning, you lean in. The surface looks like a meadow at first, then a stage, then a map of intention. Technique sits right at the front of your eye. He builds with a tiny brush that carries the smallest drink of paint. Stipple first, then a short hatch, then a dot to lift a highlight. He layers jewel tones emerald, garnet, amber into cells so small they feel enameled. He avoids glare. He aims for a covered gleam, as if light were caught and trained. No sky. That decision matters. The plane of earth becomes floor. The crowd arranges not in depth but in tiers, like theatre blocks. You read it left to right, but also down and back like a chessboard. He controls pace with density. Where he wants you to slow, he thickens texture. Where he wants you to breathe, he lets a leaf open like a small pool. Even the empty inches are work. Lean closer. Seeds become helmets. Thistles spearhead a militia. Nettle stiffs stiffen into pikes. A burr set just so reads as a rounded buckler scuffed from use. A dock leaf carries rank like a sash. He never lets a plant be just a plant. It's drafted into service without losing its plantness. That double identity, foliage and armoralet's charm and threat share a single line. Weight is a concern at this scale. He foreshortens fairies with care so their feet grip seed heads instead of floating. A heel digs into pith, toes spread, balance is physics, not myth. He sets shadows under ankles so your eye accepts mass. That's why the scene feels crowded and grounded at once. The stage effect works because the bodies obey gravity, even when no sky exists above them. You notice sight lines converging. A king shape looks past you toward a central axis. A fool leans, finger crooked, eyes drawn to the same point. Spears angle inward. Even a thistle's spine tips, barely, toward the promise of the blow. He composes like a conductor, bringing sections to a held chord. The chord is suspense. You feel the held breath, and your breath starts to match it. Read in the crowd becomes a game of folklore and theatre. Types assemble: a bearded elder with a wand of reed, a jester with acorn cap bells, a woodman with a blade meant to be used, attendants whose costumes argue status in inches. There are court figures and commoners, nimble pages and watchers at the margin who seem to guard the frame itself. He draws from old stories to gather roles, mediators, tricksters, judges, and the faceless many who witness and thus make an act social. Private myth slips in too. Some figures have tasks that only his verse explains: charge, names, titles, small duties that turn costume into function. You don't need the text to read the picture, but if you had it, you'd find an index of intent. He keeps law in the margins and performance in the paint. Psychology lives in the method, control through micro-order. A mind that once counted steps and thresholds now counts stipples and veins. Mania made miniature, you might say. But be careful with that word. What you see is a coping structure as much as a symptom. He builds a net so fine that thought can't fall through. Each dot is a promise kept. Each edge is sealed so nothing leaks. The world holds because he makes it hold. Meanwhile, a cultural echo hums outside the walls. Mid-Victorian Britain loves fairy scene stage, tableau, soft illustrations, poems that dress danger in sugar. He refuses sugar. His fair folk carry edge. Their tools cut. Their crowd can applaud a blow. He paints charm with a thin blade under it. The audience of his day might have seen whimsy. You see a tribunal, a ceremony where a community fixes its gaze on one decisive act and lends it force by watching. That act does not happen here. He withholds the master stroke. It's a compositional stroke and a moral one. In his hands, the pause becomes the subject. Suspense is the air everyone breathes. He understands that a blow freezes a scene. Anticipation keeps it alive. The title teases resolution, then denies it. The denial is merciful. It's also strategic. He doesn't want the picture to be about aftermath. He wants it to be about decisioner, second, that could still bend. Technique serves that idea line by line. He intensifies edgiers. Near the central axis, so the eye vibrates there but can't cross. He thickens stipple under the poised blade to make the ground feel ready to receive shock without showing shock. He uses warm notes around the focal figures and cools the periphery so temperature funnels you inward. He sets a tiny glint on metal and then mutes it, as if to say, not yet. Time enters the surface as labor. Years leave their trace in the way layers sit. No haste, no shortcuts. Pigment is thin in early fields, thicker in late. If you scan from left lower corner to upper right, you can read seasons of attention. He returns to a leaf months later and knots a vein in with the same hand steadiness he had on day one. The consistency is eerie and calming. The panel becomes a record of time held under discipline. Meaning builds in parallels. There's theatre with its ceremony and crowd. There's folklore with its trick and judgment. There's private law with its insistence on order. And there's the viewer's own gaze, which joins the crowd and bears some responsibility. You are a witness. By leaning in, you become part of the ceremony that pauses at the brink. The painting makes you complicit in its ethics of delay. You think about his life, the act he committed, the institution that holds him, the hand that now refuses to let a pictured blade fall. He doesn't paint confession. He paints control without harm. That reading isn't soft. It's disciplined. The work isn't redemption in any grand claim. It's a structure that keeps a dangerous logic busy with safe difficulty. The difficulty is real. Anyone who has tried to stipple a leaf to life knows what kind of hours it asks. He signs not with flourish, but with the confidence of craft. The surface is so exact you hear your own noise when you move, breath, fabric. Attendants said the pitch-quieted rooms. You feel why. It's not a lullaby. It's an attention engine. It tethers jittered to detail until the mind tires of threat and accepts pattern. Even the edges talk. Along the frame's borders, figures half enter and half leave, as if a larger procession surrounds this cut scene. That choice erases the idea of a closed tale. You're seeing one ritual, one paused moment among many, as if the world he's built runs on law beyond the canvas. It enlarges the stage without enlarging the panel. Stand back a step. The jewel tones knit into a low shimmer. Nothing is flat. Even a patch of bare ground is scaled with mark upon mark, like fish skin under light. Step closer again. A single hair stroke becomes a blade of grass. A pair of dots becomes a seed's sheen. The painting rewards every distance with a new truth. That's the mark of a world, not a mere picture. In the end, he chooses to stop before the stroke. He sets the brush down. The pause stays tuned. He leaves a note elsewhere that catalogues rolls, as if to anchor the scene in language so time can't smudge it. He accepts that incompletion is the right finish. It's not indecision. It's restraint as design. You hold the gaze a moment longer. Your chest stays at that held note. The crowd expects. The blade waits. The leaf veins gleam with patient labor. Meaning settles like dust. Control can be an art. Suspense can be merciful. And a hand that once did harm can spend years perfecting the second before harm, and stop there. Poems and paratext, elaboration in words. You'll move from the paint to the pages he kept beside it. A slim notebook, creased at corners, sits like a key. He called one long piece elimination of a picture and its subject. You opened two lines that read like a playbill, crossed with a ledger. Names stack, roles fix. The poem doesn't perform beauty. It clasps the scene so it won't slide when the brush rests. You read the cadence, short, clipped phrases. A rhyme when rhyme can bind two figures together. He lists a ferry, court, attendants, watchers, a fellow with a tool poised for the deed that never comes. The verses don't decode the painting so much as fence it. Words act as pegs. String runs between them, and the crowd inside the panel stays put. He knew that days would break his flow. The poem lets him return without drift. You feel how the naming works. Language catches each figure and pins a duty to it. A fool's cap is not mere whim. It marks permission to speak crooked truths. A woodman's blade is not only steel. It carries the weight of sanctioned action. He threads old folklore terms with private titles, a taxonomy that suits his law. The poem reads like stage notes you're not meant to see. except he leaves it in reach, as if inviting a careful eye to share his map. Verses and image answer each other. In paint, a bird shield shines. In words, a guard stands fast where the burrs are low. In paint, a thistle leans inward. In words, a thorny spear signals the crowd's agreement. He nails consent into the scene with syntax. That's what you notice. The poem supplies grammar for the theatre he's built. Who acts? Who watches? Who ratifies by gaze alone? He understands that spectators give force to acts. The poem names the witnesses so the picture breathes that truth. You trace his handwriting, neat, measured, the same discipline as his hatchings. Margins are straight, even when the wardroom jostles. He drafts rough, crosses once, and copies clean, as if he were a clerk transcribing orders. It's an old habit. In childhood, numbers and names lived in his father's books. Here, he builds his own book of rolls and lines. You can hear that desk echo. A nurse once said, the pages helped staff understand what they were seeing. You imagine the scene. A visitor peers at the panel and then the poem, and something clicks. The names reduce guesswork. The poem functions as a guide inside the asylum walls, a bridge from the inward code to a shared reading. It's not a manifesto. It's a courtesy to future eyes, and maybe to his own. On days when the world pressed and the next stroke needed a named target, there's humor, quiet and dry, threaded through. A minor character gets a title slightly too grand, as if he's teasing the puffed-up roles that crowd any court. He keeps his tone cool, never sentimental. The joke is structural, like a hinge that lets the door swing without squeal. Even jest is ordered. He never lets language run. P calls attention to staging. Lines speak of rank, file, stand, advance. Words that turn the crowd into a drilled company. That military cadence folds against fairy trappings with a friction that gives the picture its edge. He doesn't say why the fella pauses. He says who waits and how. The poem respects the pause by refusing to rush with flourish. No thunder, no gale. A held breath, written as a list. You'll notice how the paratext grows beyond one poem. He writes captions for smaller works, scraps of verse that tie a motif to an idea. Contradiction gets paired lines that set one law against another. Passion panels receive single words that serve as keys. Envy, anger, pity. Each text is a handle. You grab it, and the image turns without slipping. In a place where disorder haunts, he builds a toolkit to keep reading steady. The pages also record method. He jots, wash thin, green dry stipple stop. Not to instruct others, but to keep his own pace honest. He knows his mind can pour. The notes are sluices that keep flow from flood. If a day breaks mid-task, he writes a crib. Return to Thistlehead's right edge. Next morning, he's back in the exact inch. That's what the poem does at scale. It bookmarks the moral scene. You think of medieval illuminators who glossed margins with tiny hands pointing to text. He does a similar thing, but in reverse. His poem points back into the image. It says, this figure is not random. This gesture has a chain. The analogy holds because both practices illumination and his liveware art meets devotion to order. Tiny work done in service of a frame bigger than the page. Sometimes the words run ahead of paint. He names a character not yet drawn, sets a duty, then later paints to meet the sentence. It's a reverse sketch. Language drafts the stage direction. The brush brings it on. On other days, the paint leads, and the line in the notebook follows like a label tied to a specimen. Either way, text and image move in tandem, braided, neither bossing the other. You see one revealing note, leave stroke in silence. It appears late in the poem, near the lines that circle the fella. Silence, then, isn't absence. It's an instruction. The poem tells the painter what not to do, and by extension tells you what not to expect. The title promises action. The verses fix the pause. He refuses closure in paint, and he memorializes that refusal in words. Visitors who read the poem aloud report a curious effect. Rooms quiet. The clipped cadence settles people the way his stipple settles ground. An attendant wrote that on days when the poem was shown to guests, voices dropped after a paratext becomes atmosphere. It's not music, but it acts like a score the eye and ear can share. You close the notebook and feel how the pages enlarge the work without inflating it. They keep the picture honest to its design. They let meaning travel beyond the ward without wobble. In a century that loved moralizing captions, he turns the practice to a stricter purpose. Not moral for show, but order as anchor. You look back at the panel. The crowd waits. The blade is still in your pocket. The poem's steady names continue to list. Between them, a choice holds. The paint makes you lean in. The words keep you from rushing past the pause. Together they build a quiet engine. Attention, restraint, control. You feel it in your breath. You feel it in your hands. And you carry the list forward, because language well placed lets a fragile balance last. Other Asylum works, passions, contradiction, and seclusion. You turn from the crowded fairy stage to other panels that marked his years, and the air shifts. These are quieter, colder, more emblem than scene. The passions come first, a series where feeling is caged and posed. He builds them like stage masks, anger with a line of jaw edged like iron, envy with an eye that slides, and a hand that inches toward what isn't hers, pity leaning forward, weight in the knees, a palm open but held back by a subtle band. Each figure is ordered. The excess that passion's promise never spills. That's the key. Feeling is translated into sin. You stand close and see how he refuses his storm. Anger doesn't flare. It tightens. Grief doesn't sob. It sits and pulls its coat about itself with a neatness that hurts more than tears. Love looks straight on, not swooning, as if devotion were best shown by staying upright. He uses the vocabulary of emblem books, tributes, postures, small objects as kiso, that a viewer who reads slowly will find the code. The paint is clean. The edges hold. He will not let an emotion wreck the frame. Stakes live inside that restraint. In a place where men sometimes shout through nights, he makes images where noise cannot enter. You sense a self-lecture in the series. Feel, but don't break. Show, but don't spill. Acknowledge impulse, then seat it in a chair with arms. The staff who watch him work on these panels write notes about calm in the room. The passions teach the eye to stay. Contradiction arrives as a puzzle. Two logics share the same space and refuse to fuse. On the surface, it's a picture of two groups who inhabit one small world on different rules. A path cuts the scene. On one side, a figure steps left to right, while all signs point right to left. On the other, a structure with perfect symmetry houses a ladder that goes nowhere. You look once and think it's a whim. You look twice and feel the tension gather. He builds the tension with craft, alignments that should miss by the width of a hair. A shadow falls as if light came from two suns. A fence exists for one group and not for the other. Figures pass through on one side while, inches away, others press their palms to board. The choice isn't sloppy, it's exact. Logic A and logic B both hold within their lanes. The discomfort comes at their seam. That seam is the subject. You hold your breath and think of his mind at the threshold of belief in the world's rule. Contradiction isn't rage here, it's structure. Two orders sit inside one picture and keep not fitting. He doesn't force them to reconcile. He shows what non-fit feels like to an eye that wants unity. The eye strains. That strain is the point. He's honest about it. He doesn't paint comfort and call it truth. Then the panel that reads like a self-portrait without a face, the rock and castle of seclusion. The title tells you what the image means, but the picture carries its own weight. You stand before a cliff that is both rock and architecture, built block by block with a mason's patience. The castle grows straight from stone, as if withdrawn life could calcify into home. A narrow path climbs. Windows pin small squares of dark in the mass. There's water at the base sill, guarded by egend, a thin tree that finds perches in a crack. You trace the blocks with your finger in the air. Each stone is hatched, shaped, seated. He lavishes care on the seam between one block and the next, the fitted joint where pressure transfers. You feel safety there. You also feel airlessness. A gate exists, but it's tucked high and tight. Light touches select planes. It doesn't flood. He's tuned the castle to be refuge and trap at once. You read the title and hear both notes. A rock to cling to. A castle that keeps others out and the self in. He places a tiny figure on the path, almost lost against the mass. The figure ascends, head bowed in concentration, a hand on the wall. No threat pursues. No battlement fires. The drama is effort itself, calm, contained, endless. He's telling you something simple and hard. Retreat can be a practice, not an event. You can do it daily until the path wears smooth and the legs know the grade. He paints that practice into stone. Staff notes about this picture are brief and careful. A nurse writes that he seemed eased in the making. Another adds that the panel occupied him steadily. The superintendent, who cares about outcomes more than symbol, records improved sleep on days when stone courses advanced. The panel becomes a clock. Each course laid is an hour held. You feel time nested in the joints. Across these works, patterns keep surfacing. Obsessive detail functions as a coping frame. Micro-order replaces global certainty with local mastery. In passions, emotion is named and seated. In contradiction, misfit is contained and displayed without forced union. In seclusion, withdrawal is engineered with tenderness for the one who must live inside it. None of these pictures perform cure. They perform holding. Light behaves like a rule he can choose. In the Passion panels, it's stage light, focused, clarifying, respectful. In Contradiction, it's paradoxical, doing two things at once without apology. In Seclusion, it's sparse and angled, a tool that defines edge more than it warms space. You see him use light the way he uses line to set terms. Terms are what keep rooms safe here. You step close to the rock's surface and find the same jewel of patience you saw in the fairy crowd, but pointed at a different end. No whimsy on this wall, only work, only care that makes mass believable. He gives you a world that doesn't ask you to believe in sprites. It asks you to believe in masonry. You do. Your breathing slows because the blocks are that convincing. Pretendants who carry keys pass by and pause. Some prefer these panels to the fairy press because the moral is clearer. They say it gently. They live in rooms where the clean idea of seclusion can be a mercy. You hear that and recognize the thin line between depiction and prescription. He walks it, not with slogans, but with craft that refuses chaos. The series of passions never turns into sermon. He isn't scolding, he's arranging. The contradiction picture never descends into trick. He isn't clever for sport. He's mapping the ache where things don't join. The rock doesn't fantasize power. It acknowledges the need for walls and the cost of them. He isn't consoling you. He's being accurate about a life. Patterns in practice link art to care without slogans. Staff schedule work so he can finish a seam, a line, a leaf. He sleeps better with an edge sealed. He thanks them. They write it down. Over months, those entries become their own quiet art. Repetition with minor variation that describes a man holding in a system designed to hold him. You leave the corner where these panels hang with a steadier step. You've seen a method applied to pain. Name it, seat it. Show the misfit, don't force it. Build a refuge. Admit its cost. That's not soft. That's a discipline. You'll carry it when the story moves again, because the next room returns to the crowd and the withheld stroke, and the lessons from these walls, how to hold without harm will let you look longer without losing yourself. Medicine and mind. Victorian theories versus lived routine. You sit with a doctor's notebook and feel the gap between language and life. The page carries neat phrases, moral treatment, monomania, melancholia with exaltation, while the ward carries breath, keys, and the scrape of chair legs. Diagnosis in the mid-19th century leans on categories built from observation more than inner theory. They weigh speech, sleep, appetite, conduct. They don't have your word. They have theirs, and they use them with care, born of limits. The doctor writes that belief is fixed, not merely frequent. Fixed means a thought that sits like a nail in wood. Around that nail, other planks can still hold memory, politeness, craft. He notes coherence. He notes dangerous intersection. When a fixed belief meets an opportunity, harm can happen. He is careful to separate intent from structure. The act was planned as duty inside a system the patient trusts. That's how he frames it for the record. Victorian debates swirl outside the ward. Was the trigger heredity? Was it heat and shock from travel? Is religious language a cause, or simply the dress a delusion wears. A physician cites family temperaments. Another cites climate Egypt's glare and ritual fatigues, a stress that thinned the mind's sleep until symbols fluttered in. A third leans on moral insanity, a phrase that tries to name broken judgment without broken intellect. You hear the debate as respectful and uncertain. They argue to help, not to win. Insight, lived routine, answers more questions than theory can. Breakfast at the Bell matters more than a page on predisposition. Walks at set hours, work at a desk, permission within clear limits. These rules make the day turn without friction. He thrives on this because the structure matches his own habits. He files the world, the ward files time. Where the two systems overlap, calm grows. You stand with a nurse who reads the notes aloud in a low voice while he works, industrious, courteous, delusions unshaken. The words repeat with small shifts over months. One entry adds sleep poor after interruption. Another, appetite fair when allowed to complete a section. You watch the care become a feedback loop. The staff adjust the order. He meets the order with steadiness. The notebook heat maps a life by minor gains. Victorian medicine has ideals it calls moral treatment. No chains, if possible. Fresh air, gentle authority. Useful occupation. It distrusts spectacle and pernicious cruelties. The ward you walk has these aims, worked out in practice by people whose hands carry trays and keys. When a patient starts to shout, doors close softly, and someone sits nearby, quiet enough to avoid adding heat. When a patient like him needs time to seal a line, a meal waits 5 minutes. Medicine becomes manners at this scale. Debates about cause continues. Some point to the grand tours as a pivot weeks of sleep loss, pressure to produce constant novelty, religious scenery layered on a mind trained for order. Under that press, symbols turned from subjects to instructions. Others factor in temperament, the exactness that once built theater scenes, now repurposed to enact a private code. You keep your language plain. A careful man met conditions that turned his care into a rule that harmed. The staff don't use that sentence. They use entries. Treatment goals. Stay modest and firm. Keep him safe. Keep others safe. Give him tools to hold his hours. Don't argue with the fixed point unless argument eases him. Some days a doctor tries a soft challenge. Could the voice be mistaken? He answers with the calm he gives to composition. Error is wide, but not here. The doctor records the exchange without forcing it. He knows a standoff when he feels one. You look at restraint as it is used here. Rarely. And then with apology, like a belt across a door rather than iron on wrists. Staff prefer redirection. They bring paper, suggest a task, point to a leaf that needs veins. He takes the cue. You see how much of medicine in this place relies on the patient's willingness to meet halfway. He meets. That cooperation turns care from confinement into a working day. Theories shift as years pass. Heredity gains weight in textbooks. Case studies gather in journals. One writer suggests that men of fine sensibility face higher risk when forced through unusual pressure. Another counters that sensibility alone can't explain an act. They need a trigger, shock, infection, loss, excess, study, fright. Egypt and the Nile appear as shorthand for the foreign strain. The argument remains tentative. They don't know. They say so between lines. Modern words aren't yours to put in their mouths, but you can hold them beside the notebook like two transparencies. Schizophrenia spectrum is a phrase that tries to group fixed belief, voices, and altered affect. It's a frame built decades after his life. You place it gently at the edge and keep it labeled as modern. It explains less than you might hope. Lives don't flatten to terms. He is still a man at a desk with a small brush. Heredity enters the record as a question mark. A doctor writes, family temperament unknown. He asks the brother about mood, fears, fixed ideas. The brother answers in ordinary terms. The father kept books. The son kept lists. Careful men in careful rooms. That's as far as family law goes. Without graphs, they write anecdotes. They do not seal them as proof. Meanwhile, lived routine builds skill into care. He teaches himself how to manage pressure. When the ward hums with noise, he hums back softly and keeps his line true. When a visitor's curiosity leans too hard, he deflects to technique pigment, this brush that turned the talk cool. He shapes interactions the way he shapes panels, by directing attention. The doctor's notebook becomes a second artwork repetition with intention. Continues at picture. Speech coherent. Fixity unchanged. Grateful for materials. Slept 6 hours following completion. Refused inducements to speak against belief. Remained calm. The entries have a rhythm now, and the rhythm comforts you. It presents a man held safely by small acts, over and over, until years turn. Care has limits. The ward can't edit his core story. It can't return him to a city without risk. It can't promise a cure. It can promise breakfast, paper, and a walk under a sky crossed by wire. Within those limits, a life can be lived with dignity. He lives it. He gives the ward work that justifies its trust. They give him time he uses like paint. You step back from the notebook and return to the room where he sits. He looks up, meets your eye, and nods, the small nod he gives when a line lands right. Medicine in this place looks like that nod more than any Therian agreement between hands and rules that lets a day stand. Speaking of which, a visitor's breath fogs the glass at the end of the corridor. The outside has come to look. The notebook will grow another line, and the room will hold. Visitors, viewers, and reputation inside family comes first. A brother signs his name in the visitor's book and is led through halls at softened footsteps. You stand with him at the glass before the ward. He sees the window corner, the careful posture, the brush set at a right angle to the board. When they meet, the greeting is simple, almost plain. How are you? How is the house? Did the leak hold? Facts first. Facts are safe. He offers his brother a small drawing, a path through ferns no wider than a thumb. The brother turns it in the light and nods as if heat comes off paper. You hear a question hovered and not asked. Remorse, belief, the field. He doesn't go there. He asks instead about the old elm. It still stands. That answer lets the visit end in one piece. Occasional patrons arrive with staff near. They've heard of the industrious man with tiny armies of leaves. Inside, curiosity drops its voice. A visitor's breath fogs the glass. You watch their eyes lean to the work. The room learns silence fast. He shows technique if asked how a green is lifted with a point, how a vein sits under glaze. He names pigments and papers. He will not decode the right set on the panel. Meaning stays under craft. It's the safest way to share. Staff play the part of guardians and archivists. They number sheets, paste notes to backstate, mood, sleep after. A nurse folds a small watercolor into cardboard and sets it aside for a superintendent who believes Wrecker his care. A warder keeps a likeness he commissioned, a face plain and proud, and writes home that a man inside painted him truer than any mirror. These pages travel to mantels and drawers, where they gather dust and private reverence. Prumer of genius inside a locked place spreads slowly. A critic's friend of a friend visits an uncle who works here and goes back to London with a phrase, "Fairy scenes made with a watchmaker's hand." It's a small ripple. The city has other storms. Still, the ripple reaches artists who like order and edge. Some think of stage scenes. Others think of emblem books. Few know the ledger in the hospital that joins industry to delusion day by day. He remains steady at the center of this gentle attention. Delusion unshaken, courtesy intact. When a visitor intrudes and uses words like madness, the room cools. An attendant steers, talk to tools. The visitor accepts the cue. You feel a shared rule. No spectacle here. Respect the work and leave the man his anchor. Not all visas soothe. A young painter comes eager and quick, points too close, and asks whether the held blade is regret in disguise. He smiles without teeth and says the title's a design. He returns to the stipple and lifts a highlight on a seed helm until the leaf hums. The visitor flushes, steps back, and learns that some questions are hammers in rooms built on joints. Letters come through stir of hands with family news, births, deaths, weather. He reads them twice, then stores them under boards, as if the words could warp if left loose. He writes, replies, in small, disciplined, script thanks, good wishes, a note about a bird's visit to the elm outside the chapel. He avoids philosophy. He keeps two events that can be checked by two people standing in the same yard. The reputation inside grows on kinder terms. Attendants describe him to new hires as easy, exacting about tools, and fond of finishing a section before tea. They praise patience like a craft in itself. The doctor quotes the same line to visiting committees, industrious, courteous, fixed. You hear the cadence settle into custom. The ward's story and his story braid together like rope. A rare day breaks the routine when a newspaperman is allowed a supervised look for a piece on humane care. He sees the ferry crowd, takes notes, and murmurs that industry can bloom anywhere. He isn't allowed to print names. He prints atmosphere, instead quiet, air, windows, orders. You read the column weeks later and feel how public words slip from truth to pose, even when they mean well. The picture profits from the pose. The man remains in his chair. Unknown to them, across town, a small group of artists argue that fairy pictures are a fad gone soft. If they saw this panel, they might hold their fire, but they don't. Inside, he paints slow fire, cool. Outside, the fashion swings. The two currents hardly touch. Meanwhile, a clerk saves clippings in a folder marked with the hospital's name, not his. Inside are notes about exhibitions of fancy subjects, engravings of sylvan stages, and the odd sermon about deceit in pretty things. None mention him, sir. The clerk wants a paper trail, as if future readers will need a thread. He tucks a ward schedule in the folder, too, a timetable that tells more truth than any etching. You watch one tender scene. A patient from another ward, quiet, prone to pacing, stands near the desk and watches him paint a leaf's edge. The man's hand trembles, then settles as he tracks the small certainty of the brush. He doesn't speak. He breathes with the strokes. When the edge closes, he exhales and looks younger for a moment. He walks away slower. A nurse writes, shared calm. Family visits thin as years stack. The brother grays. His steps shorten. Still he comes, sits, and talks about roofs and roads, everything that holds. He brings small news of museums where strangers pause before pictures of kings and saints. He doesn't know that one day strangers will pause before this work and speak his brother's name as if it were always waiting for them. He knows how to hold a hand when it trembles without mentioning the tremble. That is enough. P ages in a chair that fits him. The window's light tilts through seasons. He teaches a new attendant to lay brushes flat, never bristle up in water. The attendant smiles and obeys. Habits travel. That's how influence moves inside these walls, not by manifestos, but by how a tool is put down. In the ledger, a note appears. Vision steady, hand slower. Continues at picture. You'll read it and hear the clock inside the sentence. Reputation outside will have to wait for a generation that loves archives. Reputation inside is softer and more useful. The man who kept to time, who thanked you by name, who made rooms quiet without asking for silence. Night settles early in winter. A visitor lingers at the glass and resists the urge to tap. He leans until his breath clouds and clears, and each clearing shows a leaf more vivid than before. Wonder and unease share the same frames. He walks away on lighter feet, the hush coming with him like a coat he forgot he owned. Late years, diminishing strength, persistent vision. Years accumulate like thin varnish, and you feel it in his breathing. The hand that once laid lines without tremor now pauses before each stroke. He doesn't rush the pause. He treats it as part of the method. Staff write the new cadence into the ledger, vision steady. Hand slower, and he nods when they read it back, as if hearing his body summarized helps him set the day. Health bends under confinements, long terms. Joints stiffen. Winter damp seeps into burn. He walks shorter loops on Broadmoor's paths, counting fewer turns, resting on a bench that knows him. You sit beside him, and he points with 2 fingers rather than 1, as if sharing sight instead of staking claim. He says little about ache. He folds them into routine, the way he folds everything. Inside, the studio corner remains his ground. The window throws a cool band of light across the table. He adjusts the board so the light hits where his eyes still reads best. He brings the brush to his lips to shape hairs, and then waits, a longer beat than before, for the hand to calm. When he finally sets the tip down, the leaf accepts its vein with relief that runs up your spine. Tiny work, made tender by age, feels like a pact renewed each morning. He guides you closer without words. Look, his gesture says, and you lean. Small works continue penals, modest in size, but dense in care. Themes recur. The glade with figures arranged like a court that never quite ends. The emblem face where anger tightens, not flares. The stone that stacks into refuge. Habit sharpens them. He doesn't invent much now. He refines. He moves through known rooms and dusts corners he once considered clean. Visit us thin. The brother comes, slower and grey at the Templars, and sits longer in quiet. They share weather reports. Frost laid like sugar. A storm that pulled slates. He gives his brother a new drawing. A single fern frond curled like a question mark. The brother traces the curl with a thumb in air and smiles. Neither reaches for words they don't have. Facts, then food, then a hand held a moment longer at parting. Nurses watch the rhythm and keep it safe. They learn that the day should start with a simple motif stone leaf. Should before the crowd calls. They bring tea when the figure at the edge needs only 3 strokes to resolve. They wait. Waiting here is a medical act. When he whispers thanks, he says names. Names anchor him to the room. The ledger keeps pace. Gratitude expressed. Completed section. Sleep fair. He no longer wrestles the big panel daily. He returns to it like a parishioner attending a high day, standing in the pause so many hours have tuned. He doesn't add the stroke. The choice has hardened into kindness. He tends edges, tightens a cap's gleam, strengthens a thistle spine by a hair. Then he stops, not from lack of will, but from a sense that the chord must not be struck. Restraint, at his age, is not effort, it's habit. Meanwhile, he makes smaller fairy scenes that echo the grand one at a lower key. The figures are fewer, the props simpler, the color slightly cooler. You sense he's teaching himself how to step back while staying himself. The teaching shows in the notes he leaves for tomorrow. Return to leaf by left shoe, light thin. The clarity guards against the overnight fog that sometimes meets him at waking. Illnesses nibble. A winter cough lingers. He sits with a blanket over knees, brush in right hand, rag in left, and works until the hand warms and the line steadies. Appetite narrows to certain foods, at certain hours habits, wrapped in the practical mask of preference. He keeps his corner neat, even when energy fades. Tools aligned, paper set square, drawer latched with a soft click that satisfies a rule older than ache. Staff notes, stay kind and spare, compliant, absorbed, unwavering. You feel the weight of those words now. They're not placeholders. They're a mended bridge walked daily without fuss. He is easy to care for because he meets care on its chosen ground. In a place where strain can crack rooms, his steadiness continues to quiet others. A younger patient drifts near and breathes with his strokes. An attendant stands a minute longer than needed, the way one does at an open fire. He doesn't talk about outside fame. He doesn't know its scale. A clipping might reach the superintendent's desk about a show, a review, a mention that folds his kind of work into a list. It doesn't reach him. He knows his picture. He knows the next inch. He knows that finishing a seam can make the night short in a merciful way. The rest is missed by choice or design. You watch a final season come easy. Spring grass presses green against the path edges. The elm by the wire pushes leaves like small hands. He paints a bud, not a flower, with a patience that reads like a farewell to speed. He signs a small panel with a steadier line than you expected, and looks pleased in the quiet way he allows himself, chin lowered, eyes soft. Late one afternoon, he sets the brush down and doesn't list the next step. He folds the rag and lays it across the ferrule, as he always does. Straight, smooth, respectful. He looks at the panel, not with hunger, but with the kindness you give an old friend when you rise from a long talk and know you've said enough. He meets your eye and makes the smallest nod there. It holds. Health falters by inches. A fever passes through the ward. He weathers it. A faintness follows stairs. Nurses find him a seat. He doesn't complain. He narrows the circle again. Bed, table, window, birds beyond the wire. He counts fewer steps and more breaths. The ledger keeps to its script, then turns plain, unwell. Confined to bed, comfortable, quiet. A quiet death in custody ends the entries. Records are spare and plain. Date, hour, witness. You stare at the line longer than the ink requires. It feels wrong that it fits between margins so neatly when the life it ends. Overflowed margins with points and veins and law. That's how ledgers work. They hold by shrinking. The room doesn't empty quickly. Brushes remain aligned. A panel leans dry. A nurse closes the drawer and rests a hand on the wood as if listening for a last hum of care. The window's light keeps falling across the table at the same angle. Outside, birds cross the wire like always. Inside, the quiet he made on hard days seems to linger. It will travel out of the ward, through halls, into a world that will one day lean in and learn to breathe with his lines. Afterlife of the work, rediscovery and scholarship. You step from the ward's hush into a century that learned to look again, early in the 20th century. Curators and writers begin to value what they call outsider and visionary art. The label isn't perfect, but it opens a door. His panels leave institutional drawers for cautious walls. A few small shows test public eyes. Viewers lean in and find that the patience of the hand outlives the locked door that housed it. Exhibitions set the pace. First, modest groupings, drawings from asylums, oddities beside masters, then focused rooms that let his work breathe without apology. You stand in a modern gallery, hush, and feel a familiar pull. The fairy crowd still hums. The rock still holds. The passions still sit upright and refuse storms. The distance between a hospital ledger and museum labels shrinks to a few paces, and that distance carries weight. Critics, freed from the scandal of the act by time, start writing about technique. They talk about micro-order, layered labor, the theater floor with no sky. They point to jewel tones set like enamel, to foreshortened feet that make seeds carry weight. Some note restraint, the withheld stroke has compositional courage. The essays avoid diagnosis, they stick to paint. The better ones grant the context without turning it into spectacle. Scholarship follows, slow and careful. Archivists gather letters, hospital records, early reviews, the slim notebook of verse that tethered the fairy scene. Names like Troman's Alderidge and Graysmith appear on spines and footnotes. They build an archive from scraps, visitor logs, staff notes, sale catalogues, marginal mentions in newspapers. Each writer tests claims against paper and pushes rumor aside. You feel relief when they say what they can prove and mark what they can't. Catalogues, racense, map the known works. Dates settle where records allow. Elsewhere, style and pigment help brackets form. Conservators speak about ground layers and glazes. They show cross-sections, tiny sandwiches of colorand. You see years in strata, thin and patient. A microscope finds a hair caught in varnish. It might be his or an attendant's. The lab notes resist poetry and still feel tender. Meanwhile, the public's fascination with madness threatens to swallow the art. Headline writers reach for drama. The scholar's job becomes a kind of levy. Keep the life honest. Keep the work central. Resist flattening a person to one act. Essays place the patricide inside a medical frame and refuse lurid detail. They let the paintings hold the eye first. They remind readers that institutions kept him safe and that his industry kept rooms safe in return. You see how language shifts? Lunatic yields to patient, then to specific diagnoses discussed with caution. Criminal remains in legal records where it belongs. In galleries it recedes behind artists, not as absolution, but as accurate description of labor. Curators design spaces that emphasize looking. Benches invite time. Labels mention Broadmoor and Bethlem, then list materials and dimensions, as if to say, this is work, measured and exact. Provenance gathers. A watercolor gifted to a warder's daughter reappears from a shoebox. A small panel, long thought, anonymous, gains a signature under raking light. Auction houses test the market and find that rarity and craft command attention. Prices rise, then stabilize, then rise again. Each sale sends scholars back to files to add another line. Present location known. The map of his afterlife sharpens. Writers argue gently about where to place him. Some call him a Victorian eccentric with surgical skill. Others put him near symbolists and theatre designers. Still others fold him into a lineage of English detail that runs from miniaturists to illustrators. The best accounts let him be several things at once. A man of the stage, an emblem. A clerk of leaves and law. A patient who found control in craft precise enough to quiet rooms. Museums stage focused shows. One gathers the passions and sets them in a circle like a calm choir. Another builds a small dark room for the fairy fella's masterstroke, lit so the surface glows without glare. You enter and feel the same pause the ward once held. People speak low. Someone starts to explain and then stops, realizing the painting asks for breath, not talk. You recognize the old engine working in a new house. Scholars publish letters from companions on the grand tour, careful to distinguish transcription from inference. They place his shift in Egypt within a known cadence, sleep thin, ritual heavy, heat constant and resists easy cause. They quote the doctor's notebooks and keep their voices cooled. They note how hospital routine and material permissions shaped the art you see. They keep the 80% fact balance and let the 20% be the quiet you bring to looking. An exhibition catalogue prints his poem alongside high-resolution plates. Readers trace lines with a finger in air and match names to poses. Essays explain paratext without inflating it into a confession. A footnote corrects a long-standing misattribution. Another footnote admits that some dates can't be settled without guesswork and declines to guess. The humility builds trust. University courses adopt the case from modules on Victorian culture, psychiatry, and visual narrative. Students write about audience complicity in the paused stroke, about emblem revived in a secular age, about labor as ethics. They cite primary sources. They learn to separate diagnoses from metaphor. A good seminar ends with a painting rather than a theorized close. Silence sits, and the class leaves slower than it came. You hear one warning repeat in scholarship: don't glamorize illness. Don't treat the ward as a romantic garret. The aim is care, not myth. He wasn't cured by art. He was held by it. Institutions held him too, sometimes well, sometimes merely adequately. The record shows both. A careful book makes space for gratitude and critique in the same paragraph. Digitization broadens access. High-resolution images let distant viewers lean in from desks at midnight and see the stipple, the hairline veins, the seeds turned helmets. Archives scanned ledgers so you can read "slept well" after completion in a clerk's hand. A soundless loop of turning pages reveals the bland power of repetition, industrious, courteous, fixed. The internet, noisy as it is, delivers a pocket of quiet when the painting fills a screen. The art enters popular culture, sometimes as echo, sometimes as grab. A song borrows the title, an essayist describes a picture to talk about suspense in narrative. Reproductions hang in rooms where the story isn't known, yet the pause still works. Misreadings happen. People say whimsy where there's ceremony. Others romanticize harm. Scholars answer with patience and evidence. Close look and resist cliché. It keeps the person intact. Standing in a gallery, you feel the chain from desk to wall. A nurse timed tea. An attendant locked a drawer. A doctor signed a line. A brother carried a small drawing home. A clerk kept a folder. A curator pinned a label at the right height. A writer cut adjectives. Each act, humble and small, built a path for your feet. You lean in and hear bristles in a jar, far away, ticking like a clock. The afterlife of the work lives in that sound, steady, precise, human. The fairy fella in culture, echoes and misreadings. You stand in the gallery again, but the noise comes from outside. Now reproductions in books, songs that borrow the title, essays that lift the image to explain suspense. The painting becomes a reference, a shorthand for a held breath. When people quote it, they often skip the work and reach for myth. You feel the edge of that. Echoes help the picture travel. They also blur what it is. A band names a track after the painting and sings about caprice in a green wood. The song's charm is real, but it leans on whimsy. Whimsy can cover harm, like moss covers stone. An essayist uses the picture to talk about narrative cliffhangers. He gets close when he praises restraint. He veers when he says the withheld stroke proves genius born from madness. That phrase slides. It makes illness into fuel and skips over the decades of patient craft. Reproductions multiply. Posters, postcards, calendar squares. A thumbnail can't carry stipple. At that size, the crowd collapses into noise. Viewers think clutter where the original reads as choir. You see the risk each time the image shrinks, the discipline goes invisible, and a stereotype steps in. Fairy equals cute. Cute erases ceremony. Ceremony is the heart here. Writers push back carefully. They frame the painting as labor first, symbol after. They place the titles tease in a context of theater and moral delay. They remind readers that the artist chose to pause. Choice matters. The pause is not lacked. It's design. They call out the easy line madman makes masterpiece and replace it with the harder truth. Patient worker, fixed belief, years of careful permission. That swap honors rooms and people who kept time steady. Misreadings cluster around two poles. One glamorizes illness, turning delusion into wild muse. The other flattens the work into a single act. The crime becomes lens and lock. Both ignore the complexity that invites you to look longer. Either way, the person disappears. To hold both truth's pain and polish takes effort. You feel that effort in your chest when you stand before the panel and refuse to let one story cancel the other. Museums curate the problem. They hang the painting low enough that you must lean, forcing you to trade distance for attention. Labels use plain words. Asylum, patient, permitted materials, years in the making. They avoid the lurid. They write about technique, the stipple, the jewel tones, the no sky stage. They place a bench. They trust that sitting will do some of the work. Words can't. Meanwhile, culture loves mirrors. Viewers use the painting to see themselves. Some see play. Some see threat. Some see a tribunal waiting to confirm a blow they fear in their own lives. A critic once wrote that the picture holds a crowd's gaze like a courtroom does, and that you join that gaze when you look. That reading keeps the ethics in view. It's not about sprites, it's about witness. When you lean in, your breath joins the held note. Comparison becomes a tool. Scholars set the painting next to stage to blow, and to Victorian fairy illustration to show different. Where others paint air and glow, this panel offers weight and flaw. Where others resolve with a flourish, this one restrains. The side-by-side keeps cliched at bay. It reminds you that restraint in an age of sugar is itself a statement. Another echo comes from modern fantasy art that copies surface without spirit. Artists mimic seed helmets and thistle spears and flood them with neon. The detail dazzles and empties. Without the ethic of delay, the props become costume alone. You see the shell without the engine. It's a lesson in how meaning hides in method. Method is slow. Slow rarely survives copy. Publishers print essays that trace misreadings as a genre. They catalogue how often critics smuggle diagnosis into metaphor, calling every dot a symptom. They answer with the 80/20ths balance you've carried. Fact heavy, atmosphere light. They print page images of the hospital ledger beside details of the paint, so readers must hold both. The ledger says industrious, courteous, fixed. The detail says patient, exact, paused. Together they push back on neat stories. The picture enters classrooms and YouTube feeds. A narrator whispers about quarts of leaf while a camera glides across the surface. Sometimes The whisper slides into fiction, invented names, invented motives. You feel the line cross. When the facts are enough, invention adds noise. Better to narrate the true labor, the grids, the stipple, the choice to stop and let the hush do the rest. Collectors commission prints. A good print house uses raking light to catch relief in varnish, scans in slices, stitches, and proofs until greens sit where they should. A bad one crushes mid-tones and sells glare. Quality becomes an ethics test. Care carries respect. Cheapness breeds myth. The painting also becomes a metaphor in debates about justice. Writers point to the poised blade and ask whether delay is mercy or cowardice. They argue about pauses that never end and acts that, once done, can't be undone. The panel doesn't answer, it holds the question. That's its strength. It refuses to dignify haste. It invites you to wait. You notice how often people ask, why no stroke? The most honest answers say, because he decided not to, and because choice is the point. The pause is moral and formal. It reverses the logic that ruled his worst day. In a room built on order, he learned to keep the blade still. That reading keeps you from heroizing harm. It honors change without claiming cure. Misreadings will keep coming. Culture likes easy frames. Your job, as a viewer who knows the archive, is modest. Keep looking close, correct gently, share sources, resist gossip. When someone calls the painting whimsical, take them to the thistle spine. When someone calls it confession, take them to the verse that says, leave stroke in silence. When someone treats the ward as romance, take them to the ledger, sleep fair after completion. Draw back a step. The crowd still waits. The blade still hovers. Echoes ripple around its songs, essays. Posters, but the surface remains what it has always been. Labor tuned to a held second. If you keep your eyes on the work, the myths thin. What's left is stronger. A stage with no sky. A pause that respects breath. A world that asks you to sit, learn, and not rush past the edge you feel.